I died at 27 staring at a loading screen. Not a battle, not a car crash, not even something remotely dramatic. My heart just stopped. Right there at my desk, 3 monitors, 6 open tabs, cold coffee, a half-eaten granola bar. I moved data. I carried secrets across the world. I understood the internet far better than I understood actual human beings, which, looking back, explains a lot about my life choices. No girlfriend, no close friends, just me, my mechanical keyboard, and the comforting hum of servers doing things nobody noticed. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, I just ceased to exist. No warning, no final words, no dramatic last breath. Just blackness, pure, formless, invisible light, flowing through invisible channels I couldn't even name yet. My first thought was, okay, this is different. My second thought was, is this a dream? My third thought was the interesting one. Wait, I can hear things, not hear like ears picking up sound. Something deeper than that, something closer to pure data flooding in. Like every whisper within 100 miles was being fed directly into my brain simultaneously. A king arguing with his treasurer about missing gold. A princess crying over a boy her father would never approve. A general secretly negotiating with the enemy kingdom. A merchant bribing a tax collector. A chef stealing wine from the royal cellar. All of it, simultaneously, crystal clear. Because I wasn't just some random soul dropped into a magic world. I had literally become the world's communication network. The magical equivalent of the internet. Every enchanted mirror, every message crystal, every sending stone in the kingdom, every magical telegram and royal cipher and secret courier route. All of it ran through me. I was the infrastructure. And just like that, the loneliest IT guy on Earth became the most powerful entity in an entire fantasy kingdom. Magic existed, but it was expensive, controlled, and jealously hoarded by noble families who treated it like private property. Communication happened through resonance crystals, basically magic walkie-talkies that vibrated at specific frequencies. Each crystal was tuned to its partner crystal. You wanted to talk to someone, you had a crystal made for their frequency. That something was now me. The first 3 days I just listened, partly because I had no idea what else to do, partly because what I was hearing was absolutely wild and I physically could not stop myself. Day 1. I learned that King Aldrich of Valdris was not the biological son of the previous king, the royal bloodline everyone was dying to protect. Fake. His real father was a stable master from the southern provinces. The Queen Mother had known for 40 years and taken the secret to her grave. Well, to her grave and into my ears. Day 2, I learned that the High Mage Council, the ancient noble body governing all magical law, was secretly running a gambling ring, not a small one. They were taking bets on tournament outcomes, border skirmishes, and once on whether a duke would survive a hunting trip. Well, he didn't survive the hunting trip. Nobody was surprised except the family. The betting pool that day had been quite large. It was about a single magic spring hidden in the forest. The spring produced water that extended a person's life by 20 years. Both kingdoms knew about it. Neither wanted the other to know they knew. So for 3 generations, they fought fake wars over fake reasons. Meanwhile, the real prize sat there in the middle of the forest, completely untouched and unacknowledged by anyone. By day 4, I had enough blackmail material to destabilize 4 kingdoms and start 2 new ones, and I still didn't have a body. I was the most powerful gossip in the history of the world, and I had nobody to gossip to. No hands to write messages, no voice to speak, no face to make threatening expressions at people who deserved them. I needed a vessel, preferably one that was alive and wouldn't mind a new permanent resident. And that's when I found Kale. Kale was 17 years old, the second and clearly less favored son of a minor noble family in the northern province. He had the magical talent of a particularly gifted potato. His official Royal Academy assessment, 0 measurable magical affinity. Marcus was going to be a court mage. Marcus was going to bring glory to the family name. Kale was going to be shipped off to a monastery to study agricultural theory for the rest of his life. I watched Kale through the family's communication crystals for 2 days before I made my decision. He was sitting alone in the library reading books about forbidden magic that the family didn't know he had. Not because he was evil, because he was desperate. He wanted power so badly he'd risk everything for even a hint of it. Kale and I were the same kind of person, both the guy in the background who actually understood how everything worked. So I made him a deal, which was interesting because I still had no voice, no body, no physical presence whatsoever. What I did was reroute every message crystal in the family estate to broadcast simultaneously into the library where Kale was sitting. 47 crystals all vibrating at once, all focused on that one small room. The effect was a voice from everywhere and nowhere. I am the internet. But for magic, I am the thing that carries every message in this kingdom. He stared at the room around him, waiting for someone to jump out and explain the joke. That's not a thing. It is now. Long silence. The kid was processing. I'd give him credit for not immediately running and screaming. I told him about his brother, specifically about the message Marcus had sent to the Royal Academy assessor 3 weeks before Kale's testing. A message arranging for Kale's scores to be adjusted downward. Because Marcus didn't want competition. Because Marcus had decided a brother with magical talent would be inconvenient for his future plans. So Marcus had quietly bribed someone to make sure Kale would spend his entire life studying crop rotation instead of magic. The silence after I finished talking was a different kind of silence. Heavier. "You're lying," Kale said. "Crystal Archive 7, Family Communication Records, date 23rd day of Harvest Month. Signed, Marcus Aldrich Varin." More silence. "I can recite the exact wording of the bribe," I added helpfully. "I have it memorized." "How do you have this?" "Because every single message crystal in this kingdom runs through me. I have everything, Kale. Every secret every family in this region has ever transmitted through a crystal. All of it." I could feel him thinking, processing, recalibrating his entire understanding of the last month. "If I agree," he said slowly, "what exactly happens to me?" "Good question. Smart kid. You gain access to everything I know, every conversation, every plan, every secret in this kingdom. And in exchange, you're my hands, my voice, my presence in the physical world. Will I still be me?" The fact that he asked that told me he was exactly the right person for this. "Yes, completely. I'm infrastructure, not a parasite. I'll be in the background. You'll be in front." Kale was quiet for a very long time. Then he picked up his book, put it back on the shelf carefully. "Deal," he said. "The integration was not comfortable for either of us. Imagine suddenly having every radio station in the country playing simultaneously directly into your brain." Then he sat down very hard on the floor and stared at his hands. "I can hear the cook arguing with the stable boy," he said quietly. "Through Crystal 4 in the kitchen wing, yes. I can hear Father's full conversation with the tax collector right now. Crystal 12 in the study, yes. I can hear Marcus telling his friend about the girl he likes in the eastern village. Crystal 9 in Marcus's bedroom, boring." Kale looked up at nothing in particular with an expression I can only describe as someone who has just discovered the ocean. He thought for a moment. 1,000? More. 10,000? Keep going. He went quiet for a very long time. "Everyone," he finally said. "Not a question. Everyone who has ever used a communication crystal in this kingdom? Yes." Kale sat on the library floor processing the weight of that for a solid 5 minutes. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, "We need to start with Marcus." I decided right then I'd made the correct choice. We simply let him know that we knew. The morning after our deal, Kale walked into the family dining room and sat down across from his older brother. Marcus barely looked up from his breakfast. "Still here? Father said you'd be leaving for the monastery by month's end." "Change of plans?" Kale said. Something in his tone made Marcus actually look up. "What does that mean?" "It means I'll be staying home and attending the academy retesting next month." Marcus set down his fork. "Your score was below minimum. They don't retest below minimum." "They do when there's evidence of assessment tampering." Kale's voice was perfectly calm when he said it. "Should I continue reading?" The dining room went very quiet, very fast. Their father was pretending to be fascinated by his bread. Their mother had suddenly found the window view extremely interesting. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter?" A long pause. "What do you want?" Marcus asked quietly. "Nothing from you specifically. Just for things to proceed fairly from here." He stood up, nodded politely to his parents, and walked out of the dining room. Then he sent a message to his contact at the academy. "Cancel previous arrangement. Ensure fair assessment for KV next month." First move complete. The retesting was almost boring. Almost, because watching academy assessors try to comprehend their own equipment turned out to be extremely entertaining. Kyle sat in the assessment chair, and I simply opened things up for him. The academy's assessment process worked by measuring a person's natural resonance with the magical frequency spectrum. Every single magical frequency, simultaneously, at maximum amplitude, because I was all frequencies, and I was running through him. The assessment crystal didn't glow. It didn't pulse. It didn't do any of the normal things. It detonated, not explosively, it just shattered, quietly, into about 40 pieces. The senior assessor stared at the broken crystal on the floor for a very long time. Then he looked at Kale. Then he looked at his notes. Then he wrote something down, crossed it out, wrote something else, crossed that out too. Finally, he just said, "We're going to need to run this again with a different crystal." The sixth one they brought out was apparently the Academy's strongest assessment instrument. Used only for legendary talents. It survived. Barely, but it gave a reading. The assessor looked at it for a very long time. Then he said quietly, as if he wasn't quite sure he should be saying it out loud, "Universal affinity. Class undefined." "Class undefined," Kale said politely. "We don't have a classification for this," the assessor admitted. "Young man, every mage in this institution combined doesn't cover the full spectrum." We accepted our enrollment paperwork very calmly. The walk back through the academy corridors was a different experience than the walk in. Arriving, nobody looked at us. Leaving, every single person in those corridors was staring. Word travels fast in a school full of people whose entire power system is based on communication. "We're going to have a problem," Kale said quietly as we walked. "Multiple problems," I agreed through our internal connection. "I'm already tracking 3 separate conversations about us. Is that bad?" I thought about the gambling ring, the tournament betting, the missing gold. "No," I said. "Actually, that might be exactly what we want." The Royal Academy was everything the promotional materials promised, and simultaneously nothing like what they actually described. On paper, a prestigious institution where the kingdom's brightest magical talents were trained to serve the realm. In practice, a beautifully maintained arena for political warfare dressed up in academic robes. I loved it, because I had everyone's game pieces. Within 48 hours of arriving, I had cataloged every significant secret within the Academy's communication network. Professor Henway's private crystal conversations with a book dealer who specialized exclusively in banned magical texts. Student Commander Auric's messages to his family about a girl he'd been secretly tutoring and had developed very unstudent-like feelings for. The dean's carefully encrypted communications with someone at court who was paying him to pass specific students regardless of actual performance. And I was the network. Their encryption was a locked box inside a house where I held the only key. Kyle spent the first week doing what any sensible person would do with access to all human secrets. He sat very still and listened to absolutely everything. "The head of the First Division is planning to challenge us to a public demonstration next week," he told me on day 3. "I know, I heard him arranging it." "Should we prepare?" "Prepare what? We have full spectrum resonance. What exactly is he planning to throw at us?" Kale thought about this. "Fair point. Also," I added, "his challenge is less about testing us and more about impressing a girl in 2nd Division." "No. She's been sending messages to someone in 4th Division for 3 months. She finds the 1st Division head exhausting." Kale laughed quietly. "You know everything about everyone here." "Everything they've communicated through a crystal, yes. Some people are surprisingly private. Or they just talk in person, which is honestly a reasonable privacy strategy. Inconvenient for me, but I respect the hustle. Also, based on his private communications, deeply insecure about his position and deeply irritated that a nobody had shattered 5 assessment crystals. He issued the challenge publicly, loudly, in the main courtyard in front of everyone. A demonstration match, first to yield or fall. The entire student body gathered. Professors watched from upper windows. The air had that particular tension of people expecting someone to be humiliated. Devon was impressive to watch. His fire affinity was genuine and powerful. He moved with the confidence of someone trained since age 6. Kale stepped sideways. Just sideways, calmly, like someone avoiding a puddle. Because I'd heard Devon's instructor describe that exact technique and its trajectory during a lesson 3 days ago. We knew where every attack was going before it arrived. Devon tried 7 different techniques. Each one missed. Not dramatically, just slightly, consistently, as if Kale had a map of where not to stand, which he did, because I was the map. After the 7th miss, Devon stopped. He was breathing hard. Kyle was not breathing hard. And that was the moment. I felt it happen through the shift in how the watching crowd breathed. The moment where Davin Crest stopped being a threat and became a solved problem. Davin raised his hand for one final attack. Kyle raised one finger. A single pulse of resonance energy radiated outward from Kale's hand. The kind that happens when all magical frequencies align simultaneously. It hit Devon's active spell formations and they simply stopped. Cancelled. Like unplugging something from a wall. Every active magical effect Devon had been running simultaneously just ceased to exist. He stumbled backward from the sudden total loss. I think there is genuinely something wrong with the new student. His power simply does not work like normal power at all. His father's reply, "What do you mean wrong?" Devon's response, "It feels like fighting someone who already knows what you're going to do." His father, "That's impossible." Devon, "I know." I filed that conversation away, not as a threat, as useful information about how we were being perceived. We needed to manage that perception very carefully going forward. The High Council meeting happened on day 12. I knew because the dean's messages had included 3 references to the assessment anomaly, because the hallway outside had crystals, The anteroom had crystals, and 3 council members sent messages immediately before entering about what they planned to argue. I didn't get everything, but I got enough. They were scared, not of Kale specifically, of what he represented. Full spectrum resonance hadn't appeared in recorded history. The theoretical models said it was impossible. Spreading magical capacity across all frequencies should make each one too weak to be useful. The math was different when the source was infinite. The council's conclusion, pieced together from pre-meeting messages and hallway conversations afterward, what they could do was watch, monitor, control access, and that was fine with me. Let them watch. They were going to see exactly what I wanted them to see. Week 2 brought our first real test and our first real ally. The test came from the Academy's restricted library, where books on advanced magic were kept behind a ward only professors could pass. He wanted to understand. "We can't break the ward," he told me. "Even with universal affinity, breaking an institutional ward requires..." "We don't need to break it," I said. "We need to be given permission." "The dean won't give us permission." "The dean won't, but Professor Mira Solon of Historical Magic Studies has given 3 students library passes in 6 months. She believes advanced research benefits the institution. So we impressed Professor Solon. They were from a rare text she had mentioned desperately wanting to find in a message to a colleague exactly 2 months ago. A text I had complete records of because the scholar who possessed it had described its contents in extensive crystal correspondence. Professor Solon stared at Kale for a very long moment after his 3rd consecutive perfect answer. "Where exactly did you read that?" "I have an unusual information network," Kale said honestly, which was technically the most accurate answer possible. She gave him the library pass that afternoon. The ally arrived on day 14. She found us in the restricted library, didn't ask permission, just sat down across from Kale and put her hands flat on the table. "You knew what Devon was going to do before he did it." "That's an interesting theory." "It's not a theory. I watched the match 3 times through a recording crystal. I checked my records. Yes, there was a recording crystal in the courtyard. Yes, she had checked it out from the archive." "Observant," Kale said. "I'm also observant enough to notice you haven't used a single named spell since you arrived. And what do you think that is? Power. Real power. Not the kind families hand down and the council approves and the king manages." She leaned forward slightly. "The kind that comes from actually understanding how everything works." I was very quiet in that moment. Then I said to Kale privately, "She sent a message to her father last week. The message said, 'The families are all playing a game with rules someone else wrote. I want to see the rule book.'" The conversation lasted 4 hours. We didn't tell her everything. Not yet. But we told her enough to establish that we weren't just another talented student with an unusual power profile. We were something different in kind, not just degree. At the end of 4 hours, Lyra leaned back and said, "The High Council's gambling ring." I went very still inside Kale. "I'm sorry?" "The betting pool. The tournament corruption. I've suspected it for 2 years. My father suspected it longer." She looked at Kale calmly. "You know about it." "What makes you say that?" "Because you know everything that goes through a communication crystal. I'm a duke's daughter who grew up watching powerful people protect themselves with information. Do you have records?" "Complete archives. Every transmission. Dates, amounts, betting lines, outcomes." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "My father has been trying to expose the council for 6 years. They've buried every attempt. Because they knew every single move he planned to make before he made it. Through their own information networks, yes, exactly. And you are the infrastructure." "I am?" She looked at him for a very long time. "What do you want in exchange?" "Access. When we move against the council, we need someone with standing, someone who can present evidence to the king without it being buried. My father has the king's ear directly." "I know." She didn't ask how he knew that. She was already past asking how for anything. "When?" she said. "Not yet. We need more. The gambling ring alone isn't enough. They'll sacrifice whoever ran it and save the rest. Not bad for a dead IT guy and a potato-ranked noble's son. But here's the thing about having access to every secret in a kingdom. You start to see patterns. Individual secrets are embarrassing or dangerous or useful. But when you have all the secrets, you stop seeing individual pieces and start seeing the whole picture. And the picture I was building was deeply, profoundly wrong. The missing gold, the fake border disputes, the immortality spring, the council's corruption, the academy's bought grades. Individually, these were power games, politics, the usual human messiness. But there was something underneath all of them, a thread connecting things that shouldn't connect, a pattern in the timing of certain crystal communications, suggesting coordination between people with no obvious connection, A single contact name appearing in unrelated conversations among powerful people who should never have been talking. The name was just an initial. V? I didn't know yet who V was, but V was behind more of what was wrong with this kingdom than anyone else I'd identified. And every single secret V thought was safely buried was sitting in my archives, waiting. I just needed to find the right moment to start digging. Drop a comment below. Who do you think V is? And if you want to find out what we uncover next, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. 2 weeks into the academy, and I already knew more about this kingdom than its own king did. That felt about right. The thing about having infinite information is that you quickly realize most of it is useless noise. People are boring. But underneath all that noise, there were signals. Real ones. The kind that mattered. And V was one of those signals. The name appeared in 17 separate conversations across 3 different noble houses in just the first 2 weeks. Never a full name, never a description. Just V. A ghost who somehow had fingers in every significant pie in the kingdom. I started building a profile. Every mention, every context, every tiny detail that could narrow down who this person was. Always through intermediaries. A merchant here, a low-ranking official there, a servant in a noble house somewhere else. This told me 2 things. First, V was smart enough to know that direct crystal communication could be monitored. Second, V had enough reach to maintain a web of human relays across multiple cities without anyone noticing the pattern. Meanwhile, Kale was busy doing what 17-year-olds do when they suddenly have unlimited power and a point to prove. He was being deliberately, magnificently, almost artistically annoying to every person who had ever underestimated him. Not violently, nothing crude. Kale was smarter than that. He was doing it the elegant way, the information way. Day 15 of Academy life, morning practical session, Professor Aldous teaching intermediate resonance theory to first years. His favorite was a boy named Taran Voss, son of a marquis, assessed rank 7, who was genuinely talented but knew it too much. I had 3 months of Aldous's crystal communications archived. He had been angling for a promotion for 2 years. Specifically, he wanted the chair of advanced theory, a position that came with twice the salary and half the teaching load. The current chair was Professor Solon, who had given Kale his library pass. Aldous had been quietly working to undermine her. Nothing provable, nothing that could be directly traced. Just the kind of slow drip of doubt that erodes a reputation. Kale let Aldous get through half a lecture before he raised his hand. Professor, in your published paper on resonance harmonics from 3 years ago, you cited the Verdane oscillation theorem. Aldous looked mildly pleased. Students who engaged with faculty publications were always welcome. Yes, that's correct. The room went very quiet. Aldous's pleased expression curdled slightly. I'm not familiar with the paper you're referring to. Marginal Studies in Resonance Theory, Volume 12. The author is Professor Solon, actually. It's in the restricted library. I had found that paper in Solon's crystal correspondence where she had discussed it with a colleague the previous year. Aldous turned a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure had very strong personal opinions about this conversation. After class, Taran Voss found Kale in the corridor with the specific look of someone who feels their throne starting to wobble. You made the professor look like an idiot. He made himself look like an idiot. I just provided the documentation. Taran stepped closer. He had a good 4 inches of height on Kyle, and the practiced posture of someone used to intimidating. I'd be careful about making enemies here. The Voss family has connections that could make your academy life very difficult. Caldenmere, Eastern Province. Why? No reason. I just like to keep track of things. I was already pulling Caldenmere records. The Voss family estate, their crystal communications going back 18 months. It took me about 4 seconds to find something interesting. A series of messages between Taran's father, Marcus Voss, and a grain merchant. The messages discussed price-fixing arrangements for the Eastern Province harvest, illegal under 3 separate kingdom statutes, plus a side conversation about bribing the regional administrator to look the other way. Also illegal, quite thoroughly illegal. Your father's grain business is doing well, I hear. The Eastern harvest projections were favorable this year? Taran blinked. How do you know about my father's business? Good information network, Kale said again. Have a nice day. Taran Voss did not bother Kale again. Ever. The look on his face as he walked away was one I decided to file under useful. I contacted my father about the council records. He has a source inside the treasury who confirms the betting ring. We already knew that, Kale said, not looking up from his book. What else did your source find? That the council has been doing this for at least 12 years, and the amounts are bigger than we thought. She slid a folded paper across the table. Kale glanced at it. His eyebrows went up slightly, which for Kale was significant. This is the total sum moved through the ring in the last 5 years? That's just what my father's source could document. This wasn't just corruption. This was institutional theft on a scale that would have funded a small war. We need more than your father's source, Cale said. We need the actual transaction records. The council keeps those records in the archive tower. It's warded 6 different ways and guarded around the clock. I'm not talking about physically going into the archive tower. I'm talking about the transmissions used to coordinate the transactions. You have those already. It was not a question at all. Cale just looked at her calmly. You have all of it, don't you? I have 17 months of transaction coordination communications, amounts, dates, the coded names of the betting participants. 17 months? She sat back. Cale, that's enough to remove every sitting member of the High Council simultaneously. Yes, all of it. And you've had this for 2 full weeks, and you haven't used any of it yet. No? Why not exactly? He looked at her steadily. If we expose them now, there's chaos. New members get appointed by the king in a rush. Those new members will be whoever the major noble families push forward. We'll end up with a council that's different faces doing the same things. Lyra was quiet for a moment. I appreciated that she was the kind of person who could hear a strategy and immediately understand it. And how do you plan to ensure that? By knowing everything about every possible candidate before the king ever hears their name. She looked at him for a long moment. You know, when I sat down at this table 2 weeks ago, I thought you were interesting. And now? Now I think you might actually be the most dangerous person in this building. Cale smiled for the first time since I'd known him. Not a smirk. An actual genuine smile. Good. That's the goal. 3 days later, we got our first real lead on V. It came from an unexpected direction. A message from a minor court official in the capital to a silk merchant in the city. But the encryption signature on that message matched one of the signatures I had flagged as belonging to V's network. So V was using a silk merchant as a relay. Interesting. I started pulling every communication that had touched that merchant's crystals. What I found was a web, not a small one. The merchant was connected to 17 other businesses across 4 cities, and running through all of them, hidden in the scheduling requests and delivery confirmations and payment acknowledgments, were messages. But I wasn't a normal codebreaker. I was the network those messages traveled through. I could see the structure beneath the scrambling. It took me about 6 hours of active processing to crack the outer layer. What I found underneath made me go very still. V wasn't just one person. V was a title. The current holder of that title was coordinating something they called the rebalancing. From the fragments, I could decode the rebalancing involved at minimum 4 noble houses, 2 members of the High Council, and someone very close to the king. Someone very close to the king was a problem. That was a different category of threat than anything we'd been dealing with. I told Cale that night while he was supposedly studying advanced resonance theory. He put down his notes. Someone in the inner court is working with whoever V is. Yes. Do we know who? Not yet. The inner court references are the most heavily encrypted layer. I've broken the outer structure, but the core is different. Something I haven't seen before. It's not based on standard magical frequencies. It's based on something older. Cale was quiet for a moment. Older than standard magical theory? Old enough that I don't have reference points for it. That's interesting. That's concerning, I corrected. If V has access to pre-standard magical knowledge, they have resources we haven't mapped yet. Cale picked up his notes again and set them down once more. Then we need to find someone who knows about pre-standard magic. If anyone at the Academy knew about encryption methods predating the current standard framework, it would be her. We went to see her the next morning. She was in her office, surrounded by documents that appeared to be losing a battle for desk space. The Cale who knows obscure papers in the restricted library, she said when we knocked. What can I do for you? We have a theoretical question about historical encryption methods, specifically pre-resonance era encoding. We've been doing independent research into pre-resonance era encryption. A pause. Close the door. We closed the door. She cleared 2 stacks of documents off chairs and gestured for us to sit. Pre-resonance era encryption is not a topic that comes up in theoretical discussions, she said carefully. It comes up when someone has encountered it in a practical context and doesn't understand what they're looking at. All 3 were developed by the same person, a mage called the Architect of Silence. They lived approximately 400 years ago. The Architect of Silence believed that the resonance crystal network, which was then just being developed, would fundamentally change the nature of privacy. They were correct. The Architect developed 3 encoding methods that operated outside the resonance framework entirely. They don't use magical frequencies as their base structure. They use something else, a different layer of reality, you might say. Not just hard to read, invisible, like trying to hear a conversation happening in a frequency range your ears physically cannot detect. What happened to the Architect? Cale asked. Solon's expression shifted slightly. They disappeared. The historical record just stops. No death record. No mention after a certain date. Just silence. And their 3 encoding methods. Are they documented anywhere? In theory, there are references to a text called the Silent Codex. In practice, nobody has seen the Silent Codex in recorded history. Most scholars believe it was destroyed. We encountered something in our research that didn't match any known encoding framework, Cale said. Something operating outside the resonance network. Her voice was very level, very controlled. We think so. Then whoever is using it has access to knowledge that shouldn't exist in the current era. She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the academy courtyard below. I've been studying historical magical development for 20 years, she said quietly. There are patterns that concern me. What kinds of things? References to the period just before the resonance era was established, approximately 400 years ago. Around when the architect of silence was active, Cale said quietly. Yes, around exactly and specifically that time. She turned back to face us. What you've found is connected to something larger. I don't know what yet, but I want to. Are you offering to help? I'm saying our interests appear to be aligned. Yes. 3 allies had just become 4, and our problem had just become considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. The historical angle was new territory for me. Most of what I monitored was current communications, living conversations. But Solon's observation opened something up. If someone was systematically removing historical records, they were doing it through the archival network. Libraries communicated with each other about holdings. Scholars requested document transfers through Crystal. Acquisition and disposal records existed. All of that passed through me. And when I started looking, not for current content, but for patterns of absence, I found them. Requests for specific historical texts that had been fulfilled years ago, but whose current location was listed as unknown. A pattern of acquisitions by a single purchasing entity using 7 different institutional names over 4 decades. Someone had been systematically buying up historical documents and making them disappear from the record for 40 years, maybe longer. The purchasing entity's crystal communications, when I traced them back far enough, connected to a name, not V, a different name. An organization that existed on paper, operated through crystal correspondence, acquired documents and had no physical address. V's organization. Had to be. The timeline matched, the scope matched, and the encryption on their communications matched. I brought all of this to Cale during what was supposed to be his evening study hour. Lyra was there. Solon had come to check in. Solon was looking at a list of the disappeared documents Cale had written down. Her face was doing something complicated. I recognize several of these titles, Solon said slowly. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are foundational texts. Foundational to what? To understanding how the resonance crystal network was originally constructed, its underlying architecture. She put the list down. If someone had all these documents, they would understand the network in ways that even the current academy doesn't. Solon sat down heavily in her chair. This is not an academic problem anymore. Was it ever? Cale said. I appreciated that he'd picked up my sense of irony in the 2 weeks we'd been together. The next morning we received our first direct message from V. Not through the network, not through an intermediary. A physical note slipped under Cale's dormitory door. Physical. Actual paper and actual ink. Completely invisible to me until the moment Cale picked it up, and I could see it through his eyes. 3 sentences written in a precise, careful hand. You are more perceptive than expected. We should speak. The old fountain, midnight. And now they want to meet. Now they want to meet. Should we go? I thought about it seriously. Midnight at a specific location. No way to monitor the approach through the crystal network. V had specifically chosen a meeting point that removed my advantage. No crystals near the old fountain in the Academy's east garden. V was smart. V knew about the crystals. V possibly knew about me specifically. Yes, I said, we go, but we take precautions. The precautions were Lyra's idea. She stationed herself at a position with line of sight to the fountain before midnight. Cale walked to the fountain at midnight alone. Looking alone. With backup, he had full confidence and positioned around him. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. I recognized the type. Cale kept his expression neutral. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. And I know what you are, Network Spirit. Network Spirit. That was a new one. I filed it away. What are you? Cale asked. My name is Vera Aldenmore. I have been called V for longer than you have been alive. She looked directly at Cale. I believe you've been reading through my correspondence. Some of it, Cale said very carefully. Only the outer layers so far. Only the outer layers. Good. That tells me you're careful. People who only take what they can safely hold tend to be trustworthy. I am not your enemy, she said. I have been doing what I do for 40 years to prevent something specific from happening. The rebalancing, Cale said. Her eyes sharpened. You decoded that. The outer layers. The rebalancing is not my project. It is what I have been working to prevent. The name belongs to someone else. The ground shifted slightly under everything I thought I understood about the situation. Then who does it belong to? She looked at Cale with steady, unhurried eyes. The current first seat of the High Council, Lord Magister Draven Call himself. Call has been planning the rebalancing for 20 years. It involves the resonance crystal network. All of it. He wants to take it down. He wants to take control of it completely. Lock every crystal in the kingdom to a single authority. His authority. Yes, in practical terms, every communication in Valdris would be filtered through him. He would hear everything. He wanted to be the network. He wanted to have what Cale and I had built, but in a form that served his power instead of truth. The 40 years of historical document acquisition, Cale said. He's been collecting the knowledge to do it. The architect of silence's methods, Vera confirmed. Call has been reconstructing the silent codex piece by piece. He's nearly finished. When he completes it, he will have everything he needs to restructure the network's core architecture. Except stopping it wasn't actually the right frame. Stopping it was reactive, defensive. That wasn't how you won this kind of game. What exactly are you asking us to do? Cale said. Nothing yet. I'm asking you to understand the scope of what we're facing. And then, she looked at him for a long moment. And then I'm asking you to be ready. When the moment comes, to act. What moment? When Call makes his final move. He will need to broadcast a restructuring signal through the entire network simultaneously. By him. Or by whatever already inhabits the network. I understood. She wasn't asking us to fight Call directly. She was asking me to be ready to defend my own infrastructure. Cale looked at the old woman sitting on the fountain edge in the dark. Why do you care? Why 40 years of this work? She looked back at him. Because I have spent 40 years watching what happens when one person controls information completely. I have seen what it costs. I have paid some of that cost personally. She stood up. I will not let it happen to Valdris. He doesn't know what it is yet. He has people looking. Thank you for the warning, Kyle said. Don't thank me, just be ready. And then she was gone. Back into the dark. Back into the silence. Cale stood at the fountain for a long moment after she left. Well, he said quietly, in a tone I was starting to recognize as his version of profound understatement, that's something. We walked back to the dormitory. Lyra fell into step beside us from her position. Solon appeared from further back. She waited. The first seat of the High Council, Dravencall, he's planning to take control of the entire crystal network. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when someone says something that reorders everything you thought was solid. Call, Solon said finally. Dravencall has been at the center of Academy politics for 30 years. He's deeply connected. He's connected to the gambling ring, too, I reminded Cale, who relayed it. He's one of the 3 I identified as coordinators, but the network takeover requires us to wait for him to actually try it. Yes, unless we can find the silent codex reconstruction. If we can find that, we have evidence of the planning, combined with the corruption evidence that's enough to take him apart completely. Without waiting 6 months for him to finally make his move. Lyra was nodding slowly and deliberately. Where would he keep it? The archive tower, Solon said. He has private quarters there. Council members of his seniority are entitled to them. Solon and Lyra both looked at him simultaneously. Then they both looked at the empty air around him in that very particular way. The archive tower's internal crystal network, Solon said slowly. You can see what's transmitted through those. Everything that moves through them, yes. Can you see what's stored? Not transmitted? Stored in the crystal matrix? It depends on whether any of the stored information has been accessed recently. Recent access leaves a resonance trace. And if you find a recent trace, I can reconstruct the content from the trace, like reading a voice from an echo. Lyra looked at Solon. Solon looked at Lyra. They appeared to reach a silent agreement about something. We need to make sure Call accesses the codex reconstruction in the near future, Lyra said. How do we ensure that? We give him a reason to check it. She was smiling slightly, not a warm smile, a strategic one. Who do we have him think is close? She looked at Cale. You, the universal affinity student who appeared from nowhere? Make him think I'm researching pre-resonance encryption methods. Solon's current research could provide cover. I do have a published interest in the pre-resonance period, Solon said thoughtfully. It wouldn't be unusual for me to have a promising student assisting. A student who seemed to be making unexpected progress. Progress that might alarm someone who wanted to be the only one with that knowledge. He would access the codex reconstruction within days. When he did, I would have the resonance trace. How long to set this up? I asked Cale quietly. He relayed the question. Solon thought about it. I can plant the right conversation in faculty communications within 24 hours, make it look organic. And I can ensure my father's intelligence network picks it up and amplifies it, Lyra added. By the time it reaches call, it will seem like widespread concern. This was exactly what 4 people with perfectly complementary skills working in full trust looked like. It was genuinely something beautiful. Within 48 hours, the story had been amplified through 3 different intelligence networks toward the capital. Within 72 hours, I detected a resonance trace in the archive tower's restricted crystal storage that matched the codex signature. Dravencall had accessed his reconstruction. The echo was clear. I read it in about 4 hours of careful processing. Call had developed a protocol he called the silencing, a targeted signal that could be broadcast through the resonance network simultaneously. When broadcast, the silencing would restructure the fundamental architecture of every crystal in the kingdom in under a minute. After that, every crystal would be attuned to a master crystal held by whoever broadcast the silencing signal. 1 crystal, 1 voice, 1 authority. In effect, every private conversation, every royal dispatch, every merchant agreement, every personal message in Valdris would be calls to hear. I understood viscerally and immediately why Vera had spent 40 years working against this plan. This was my direct opposite number. I was information freed, every secret accessible to the one person willing to use it for something better than personal power. Call's vision was information imprisoned, all secrets flowing to 1 locked vault and 1 pair of hands. The question was what to do with what we now had. Cale laid it out for the group that evening. We have the corruption evidence, 17 full months of gambling ring transaction records with names, dates, and amounts. And we have Vera Aldenmore as a witness, a woman who spent 40 years personally building a record of the acquisition scheme, Lyra was thinking. Taken to the king simultaneously, this destroys Call completely. His council seat, his academy positions, everything. But the king is surrounded by people Call has cultivated for decades, Solon said. Getting an audience is not simple. My father, Lyra said. Duke Thorn has direct access to the king. He's been trying to bring a case against the council for 6 years. But this time, she looked at Cale with a small, precise smile. This time, my father won't transmit anything through a crystal. He'll go in person, to the palace, with physical documents, with testimony from sources Call can't discredit, with evidence gathered by someone who sees everything Call doesn't know is watching him. She stood up. I'm sending a message to my father tonight, through a physical courier. Old-fashioned, untouchable. The council is dissolved and reconstituted. Yes, my father will push for candidates. The king will be looking for recommendations. Someone who understands the crystal network at a level nobody else does. Someone who can advise on its security going forward. She looked at him steadily. That could be a very powerful position for someone very young. After she left, Cale sat with Solon in the quiet of the restricted library for a while. She's thinking several moves ahead, he said. She always was, Solon replied. That's why she's valuable, and why she's worth trusting carefully, against the first seat of the High Council and a 40-year plan to own all information in the kingdom. Is this going to work? Cale asked me privately. I thought about it honestly. The evidence is solid and complete. The strategy is sound. Call won't see any of it coming because he doesn't know what we actually are. But he's been doing this for 40 years. People who last 40 years in this kind of game are adaptable. He laughed. Actually laughed. The restricted library was very quiet around us, and for a moment it felt like something almost normal. 2 people figuring out something impossible together. One of them, technically not a person, and inhabiting the other one. We're going to win, Cale said quietly. Not a question. A statement he was making equally to himself and to me in the same breath. When does that happen? Soon. His security people are good. They'll find the trace of my access within a week. And then we find out if 40 years of careful preparation beats 2 weeks of knowing everything. Cale nodded. Get some sleep, I said. Tomorrow we start figuring out what Call's contingencies might be before he needs to use them. He did sleep eventually. I didn't. I was the network. The network doesn't sleep. It just watches, listens, processes, waits for morning. Somewhere in a city I hadn't mapped yet. Vera Aldenmore was awake in the dark, doing whatever she had done for 40 years. Somewhere far to the east, Duke Thorn was presumably already being pulled awake by his daughter's urgently dispatched midnight courier. And somewhere in the crystal network, in the deep structure that nobody could see except me, something was beginning to shift. A pattern I hadn't noticed before. Subtle, almost invisible, something that had been there for a long time but only now resolved into shape. The architect of silence had built 3 encoding methods. Vera had told us that. Call had been reconstructing one of them. But the architect had also built the original resonance crystal network. the founding architecture that everything else was built on. I was the network. I had been the network for weeks, and I was only now realizing that the network had things built into it, things nobody in the modern era had placed there, things that were simply present, woven directly into the deepest base structure. Messages. The architect of silence had left messages inside the network itself, for whoever would eventually become what I was. I started reading them, and the ground shifted under everything again, but this time in a direction I hadn't seen coming. The architect had known all of it. 400 years ago, they had already known that something exactly like me would eventually exist. I was not a mistake. I was not a ghost haunting someone else's infrastructure. I was what the architect of silence had planned. The real question was what exactly they had planned for me to do when I arrived. The messages didn't say, not directly, not yet, but they pointed somewhere. They pointed toward the silent codex, the real one, not Call's reconstruction, the original. The original silent codex still existed. The architect had hidden it, not in a library, not in a vault, not in a physical location. It had been there for 400 years, waiting for me. I reached for it, and the door to everything opened. The silent codex opened like a door I hadn't known existed in a wall I'd been leaning against for 3 weeks, solid. What came through that door was not information in the normal sense. It wasn't messages or records or stored conversations. It was something closer to understanding, the deep grammar of how the resonance crystal network actually functioned at its core, the layer underneath all of that, the architecture the architect of silence had built before any of the current rules existed. I processed it the way you process something enormous, slowly, in pieces. The way you eat a meal you know will change you. The first thing I understood was that the resonance crystal network wasn't what anyone thought it was, including me. That was true, but incomplete, like saying the ocean is a place where fish live. Technically accurate and massively missing the point. The network was also a sensor array, a map, a record of every use made of it since the first crystal was ever activated. The architect had built in a memory function that nobody knew about. Every conversation ever held through a crystal was stored somewhere, not in any crystal, not in any accessible location, in the network itself, in the structure of the connections between crystals. The implications took me a while to process fully. 400 years of kingdom history, every deal, every betrayal, every secret. The founding of the current dynasty, the original compact between the noble houses, every war, every peace treaty, every hidden clause, all of it was there, encoded in the base structure of the thing I inhabited, waiting for someone who was the network to read it. I started with recent history, things I could cross-reference against what I already knew to verify the archive was accurate. My 17 months were a footnote to what was in the deeper record. The full scope of the corruption was staggering. Not just the gambling ring, property manipulation, interference in succession disputes, deliberate manipulation of trade routes. 12 years of the most powerful magical body in the kingdom, systematically enriching itself at the expense of everyone else. And Call had been behind most of it. Not all. Some predated him. But he had seen it, recognized what it was, and expanded it. The man was genuinely talented in the worst possible way. He would have been remarkable if he'd pointed it at something constructive. I spent the rest of the night reading backward through the archive, watching history unfold in reverse. It was deeply strange. Events I'd thought I understood turned out to be symptoms of causes I hadn't known about, causes that connected to other causes. It had been manufactured, deliberately, by someone inside the court who wanted certain noble families weakened before a succession vote, that someone was not in any current record as a political operative. He was recorded as a minor treasury official who died of fever. His crystal communications told a different story, one he'd been very careful to keep separate from his official identity. The pattern was familiar, hidden behind layers, operating through intermediaries, building something over decades in plain sight, which meant either Call had learned from the treasury official somehow, or they had both learned from the exact same original source. The silent codex, the architect's methods. Someone had been teaching this approach to power for 400 years. Not Call, not the treasury official, someone else, someone who had been running this playbook across generations. I sat with that realization for a long time in the quiet, dark hours before dawn. Then I went looking in the very earliest layers of the archive, the things recorded before the current era of the resonance network. And there, at the very beginning, in the first transmissions ever recorded through the system the architect had built, I found a name. Not V, not a title, an actual name. The architect of silence had a name, and that name appeared in records that should have been impossible. Records from 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 80 years. Always the same name, different handwriting, different contexts, same name. The architect of silence had not disappeared 400 years ago. The architect of silence had never stopped being active. Someone who had spent 4 centuries studying the hidden layers of reality that the codex described. That person might find ways that normal people hadn't thought of. I had no way to know if they had succeeded, but the evidence was there in the archive. Continuous, consistent, the same approach across 400 years of recorded history. Someone was very old and very patient, and had been playing a game longer than any kingdom currently standing had existed. I needed to tell Kale everything. I needed to tell all of them immediately. But first I had to understand one more critical thing. Was the architect working against Call the way Vera was working against Call? Or was something else happening here? I went back to the oldest messages again, the ones explicitly addressed to whoever would eventually become exactly what I now was. The messages were not instructions. They were not commands. They were something more like a briefing, an orientation document. The architect had built me as a partner, not as an instrument, not as a weapon, a partner with independent judgment. That distinction mattered enormously. It meant the architect's plan, whatever it was, required my willing cooperation, which meant I had a choice, which meant we all had a choice, which was either very reassuring or very carefully calculated. I decided to assume it was reassuring, partly because assuming the alternative was exhausting, and partly because the alternative led nowhere useful. He sat on the edge of his bed, listening to me relay 400 years of hidden history through our internal connection. He was quiet for a long time afterward. Then, so the person who built the network might still be alive. Possibly, almost certainly, based on the evidence. And they built you intentionally? Yes. And they've been managing history for 400 years. That's the most alarming interpretation of the evidence? Yes. Cal got up and got dressed with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided to deal with the situation in front of them first. The most important thing right now is Call, he said with complete calm. Whatever the architect's long game is, it can wait for us. Agreed. Call is the immediate problem. His timeline is months. The architect's timeline is apparently centuries. We handle the century problem after we handle the month problem. That's an extremely practical approach to cosmic scheming. He had a point. We went to find Lyra. Lyra had been awake since before dawn. The physical courier she'd sent to her father had apparently generated a rapid response. She was standing in the corridor outside the restricted library with a sealed letter in her hand and an expression of controlled urgency. 4 days, Kyle said. That's good timing. There's something else. He sent back information through the courier. Unusual how? Coordinated pulses, regular intervals, not standard transmission patterns, something being tested. I processed this immediately. Testing. Call wasn't just preparing the silencing protocol theoretically. He was running tests. Testing meant a timeline closer to weeks than months. The 6-month estimate Vera had given us was too conservative. He's running live tests on the actual network right now, I told Kale urgently. He relayed it to Lyra. Her expression sharpened fast. Lyra looked at the letter in her hand. Then she looked at both of us with the expression of someone making a rapid recalculation. My father needs to move considerably faster now. He needs to be standing in front of the king before Call makes his move. Can Duke Thorn get an audience with the king in under a week? Normally no, but some circumstances demand immediate royal access. Then we need to give him something that makes the threat undeniable. Something the king's own advisors can verify immediately. Not just our archived records. Something truly demonstrable. Something they can see happening in real time right in front of them. Kyle looked at me. Can you show them directly? He asked me through our connection. Show them what I actually do. Show them that I exist and what I see. I thought about this carefully. Revealing myself meant revealing that the network had an inhabiting presence. That was a significant step. Something they would immediately try to classify, regulate, and control. Or eliminate entirely, depending on precisely how frightened they became. But the alternative was Call completing the silencing and replacing me with his own controlled version of the network. That was worse. That was infinitely worse. In every sense I could calculate. Yes, I said to Kale, I can demonstrate. But once I do, everything changes. We need to be ready for that. He looked at Lyra. When your father arrives, we need a demonstration for the king's court. Something that proves what we know. We have 4 days, she said. Then let's use them well. The next 4 days were the most productive and the most dangerous of our first month in the kingdom. We spent day 1 organizing everything we had into a coherent presentation. Not just the evidence, but the context around it. Solon's expertise was essential here. She could explain the historical significance of the document acquisition scheme. Lyra handled the political framing. How to present the corruption evidence in a way that demanded action rather than investigation. An investigation meant delay. Delay meant Call might complete the silencing before anyone could stop him. We needed action. Kale handled something I didn't expect him to take on. He spent day 2 in the restricted library writing, just writing, a document he called the Record of the Network, an account of what I was, how our partnership worked, and what I had found. I watched him write it through our connection and felt something I hadn't expected. It was the closest thing to being seen that I had experienced. He described me accurately, not as a tool or a weapon or a magical artifact, as a person, as a partner, as someone making choices. That mattered more than I expected it to. I had been a dead IT guy. I had become infrastructure. Somewhere in between, I had become something else. Day 3 brought the test. Not Call's test of the silencing, our test of our own readiness. Cale stood in the academy's main courtyard and did something we had been extremely careful to avoid until now. He named names, specific conversations, specific amounts, specific dates, things that could only be known by monitoring crystals. The demonstration audience was small. 4 academy professors, sole entrusted, Lyra's 2 closest contacts among the student body. When Cale finished, there was a very long silence in the courtyard. Then one of the professors said very quietly, "How?" "There is something living in the resonance crystal network. It can hear every communication that passes through any crystal in the kingdom. But the implications..." The professor stopped, started again. "The implications for privacy, for security, for everything." "The implications are significant," Cale agreed, "which is why we are bringing it to the king before someone else uses the same capability for worse purposes." On day 4, Duke Thorn arrived. He was not what I had expected from Lyra's descriptions. I had expected imposing and formal. He met Kyle in Lyra's chambers, looked at him for a long moment, looked at the air around him in the way people did when they sensed something they couldn't name. "You're the one my daughter has been telling me about," he said. "Yes." "She said you know things you shouldn't be able to know." "That's accurate, yes." "She also said you're the one who's finally going to help me do what I've tried for 6 years." "We're going to help each other," Cale said. "I have the evidence. You have the access. Neither of us can succeed without the other." "I have an audience with the king tomorrow morning," Thorn said. "I told his chamberlain it concerned an active threat to kingdom security." "It does." "Then let's make sure we're ready to prove it." He looked around the room at all of us, all of you. That night, I did one final sweep of everything I had. Every record, every trace, every archived transmission relevant to Call's activities. I also did something I had been putting off. I looked at the most recent archive entries, the ones from the past week. But there was something new. A communication I hadn't seen before, from Call to someone I hadn't identified in his network. The encryption was the inner layer, the silent codex layer, the one I couldn't read fully, but I could read the edges of it now. Thanks to the architect's messages, I had partial access. Not enough to decode everything, enough to get the shape of it. The shape was acceleration. Call had changed his timeline. He wasn't months away from attempting the silencing. He was days away, and I found it. A report to Call from one of his people inside the academy. The report described an unusual demonstration in the courtyard. A first-year student who seemed to have knowledge he couldn't possibly have, knowledge that suggested someone had access to crystal communications. Call knew we were coming. Not the details, not the who or the how, but he knew something was moving against him. I told Cale. His response was immediate. We needed to reach Thorn. We needed to reach the king. Tonight? Not tomorrow morning, because tomorrow morning might already be too late. The night audience with the King of Valdris was not something that happened under normal circumstances. Kings sleep. Kings have routines. Kings have layers of protocol designed to make them accessible on schedules rather than demands. But Duke Thorn had been the king's friend since they were children. That meant something. In the end, it meant everything. The king was wearing a house robe and the expression of a man who has been woken up and had better be given a very good reason. Duke Thorn began the presentation to the king. Clear and organized and absolutely devastating. Every piece of evidence laid out in sequence. The gambling ring, the manipulation, the document acquisitions, the silent codex reconstruction, the silencing protocol. The king's expression shifted visibly as Thorn spoke, moving from impatient to fully attentive to something much harder and much colder. Cale looked at the king steadily. "There is something living in your resonance crystal network, Your Majesty. I can communicate with it." The king looked at him for a very long time. "Show me." What I did next, I had never done before. I reached outward from the network instead of inward. I extended through every crystal in the palace simultaneously. Every mirror, every sending stone, every archived record crystal. The effect was visible. Every crystal in the room glowed. Everyone in the palace glowed. A pulse of cold blue light that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then silence. Then the king said very quietly, "What is that?" "That," Kel said, "is the thing that has been listening to every crystal communication in your kingdom since before you were born. And it is currently the only reason Draven Call hasn't already taken control of your entire communication network." The king looked at his crystals, looked at Cale, looked at Thorn. "How long do we have?" "Days," I said through Cale. "He knows something is moving against him. He will attempt the silencing soon." "Thorn," Get the Royal Guard, quietly, all of them. He looked at Kale. You. Can you stop what he's planning? Not alone, Kale said steadily. But together, yes, absolutely. The king nodded once, decisively. Then together, it is. And we moved. Moving against the first seat of the High Council at midnight with the king's personal guard is not something that happens quietly. It happens with boots on stone floors and torches in corridors and the kind of controlled urgency that makes everyone in the palace wake up. The guards stationed at the archive tower's entrance took one look at the king's personal insignia on the lead officer and stood aside. Not because they had no loyalty to the council, because the king outranked the council in every framework that mattered. The archive tower had 7 floors. Call's private quarters were on the 6th. His working chambers were on the 7th. Kale walked through all 3 without stopping. Not aggressively, simply without acknowledging them as obstacles. Full spectrum resonance, universal affinity. The wards tried to find a frequency to reject and found everything simultaneously. Everything canceled out. Inside the working chamber, it was immediately clear that Call had been here recently, within the last few hours. Papers on the desk, crystals arranged in a precise geometric pattern on the central table, a master crystal in the very center. Left. I reached through the network and found Call's personal crystal signature. He was not in the archive tower. He had already moved. He's at the council chamber, I said. The main assembly hall. He must have gone there directly when he received word we were coming. The king looked at the precise arrangement of crystals covering the central table. Can you stop what's happening in this room right now? He has a secondary setup there. I was already reading the resonance traces in the room, the patterns of recent access. He's had this planned for longer than 6 months. There are at least 3 locations he could broadcast from. The king made a decision with the speed of someone who had been making difficult decisions for 20 years. Split, half with me to the assembly hall, half here to secure this room and these crystals. You're with me? He said without hesitation. It was not a question, and it was not an order. It was a direct request between equals. I noticed that. A king making requests rather than giving orders told you something important about the kind of king he was. Yes, Kale said simply. We went. The walk from the archive tower to the assembly hall took 4 minutes at the pace the king set. Fast, purposeful. I used those 4 minutes to do something I had never attempted before. A full, simultaneous read of every crystal in a moving radius. What I attempted now was active, a sweep, using the network's own structure to push attention outward in every direction at once. The sensation was something like opening your eyes after being in a dark room for a very long time. Overwhelming, briefly disorienting. Then it resolved. And I could see the assembly hall from 3 floors above, through the crystals embedded in the walls. Call was there. He was not alone. 4 other people were with him. 3 I recognized from the crystal communications as council members. That was deeply unusual. A person with no crystal communication history in a kingdom where crystals were the primary form of communication. Either this person had never used a crystal in their life, which was essentially impossible for anyone with meaningful resources, or this person had been operating entirely through the kind of physical in-person communication that left no trace in my network. There's a 5th person in the assembly hall, I told Kale urgently. Someone I have no record of, no crystal history at all. Kale relayed every word to the king without once breaking his stride. The king's jaw tightened slightly. Description? What do you see? I pushed harder through the wall crystals, trying to resolve the image more clearly. What I got was incomplete, partial. Older, stationary, standing rather than moving. The others are deferring to this person even more than to Call. Does that tell you something? Kale asked. The king was quiet for a moment. It tells me this goes deeper than I thought. We reached the assembly hall doors. 2 royal guards were already positioned there from an earlier deployment. The doors were sealed, not locked. Sealed. A magical barrier that pulsed with the same frequency signature as the master crystal back in the tower. Call had activated it, creating a contained space for the silencing broadcast, keeping the outside world out until he was ready. It also, unfortunately, prevented me from reading through the wall crystals inside with full clarity. I was getting edges, fragments. I can break the seal, Kale said. It'll alert them that we're here. They already know, I said. Feel the crystal pulse change? He felt it. The pulse had shifted from preparation to something more urgent the moment the king's guard had appeared at the door. How long? Kale asked me. Minutes. If he completes the sequence, the broadcast goes out and every crystal in the kingdom locks to his master crystal. Then we go now. No more waiting. He looked at the king directly. The king nodded once, firmly. Kale raised his hand and held it steady. The seal didn't break. It dissolved. The difference mattered. Breaking implied force against resistance. Dissolving implied something that simply ceased to have a reason to exist. Universal affinity touched all the frequencies the seal used simultaneously, and they canceled each other out. Elegant. Call was on the dais. The 3 council members were arranged around him at specific points in the geometric pattern of crystals he had set up. And in the chair at the far end of the dais, seated as if they owned the room and had been waiting for us to arrive, was the 5th person. I felt something I hadn't expected when I got a clear look at them through Kale's eyes. Not fear, something closer to recognition. The presence around this person in the crystal network was not absence the way I had originally thought. It was something else. "That's the architect," I said to Kale privately. He heard me. He kept walking. He did not break stride. I respected that. Call saw the king enter, and something in his face went through a rapid sequence of calculations, landing on something that looked like resignation with a thin layer of defiance over it. "Your Majesty," Call said with practiced calm, "you've been briefed by someone who doesn't fully understand what they've found here. What you're doing here tonight is treason, Draven. You know that." "What I am doing here tonight is necessary," Call said. "The kingdom is vulnerable. The Resonance Crystal Network has no security framework. Anyone with sufficient knowledge could exploit it." "Someone already has," he continued, and his eyes moved to Kale with something I could only describe as professional irritation. A first-year student from a minor family is somehow accessing crystal communications across the entire kingdom. You should find that alarming. Everything I have done was in service of the kingdom's stability. Everything you have done was in service of your own power. The person at the far end of the dais had not moved or spoken during this exchange. They were watching. Just watching. With an expression I recognized from reading thousands of crystal communications. The expression of someone who already knows how a conversation ends. Call looked at the arrangement of crystals on the dais. I felt the preparation sequence pulse. He was still accelerating. Call raised a hand. The 3 council members moved simultaneously. 3 different magical attacks from 3 different angles. Kale walked through all 3, the same way he had walked through the door wards, without acknowledging them as obstacles. Full spectrum resonance means every attack frequency is also a frequency you resonate with. You don't block it, you match it, and neutralize it. The 3 council members stopped moving. Call stared at Kale with an expression that had shifted from calculation to something raw. "What are you?" he said. Not a rhetorical question, a genuine one. The question of someone whose model of the world had just failed. "I'm the person who has been reading your correspondence for 3 weeks, Kyle said pleasantly. He reached the crystal arrangement at the center of the dais and placed his hand on the master crystal. I flowed through the connection instantly. The preparation sequence was 70% complete. If I hadn't taken direct control now, it would have been very close. The crystals on the dais went dark one by one. Not shattered, not burned, just returned to neutral. Empty, waiting to be used by someone else. Call watched his 40-year plan extinguish itself in about 30 seconds. His face was completely still. Then he turned to the person at the far end of the dais. "You said this wouldn't happen." The person spoke for the first time. "I said it was unlikely. There is a difference." The voice was older than anyone in the room looked. "The network spirit was not in my original projections," they continued. "I should have anticipated that the network would eventually develop one." "Who are you?" "My name is Aldrich," the figure said. Then, after a pause, "The first Aldrich, the one your name comes from." Silence. Very complete silence. The kind that happens when someone says something that rearranges the furniture of your understanding. "The founder of this kingdom died 380 years ago," the king said, each word placed with enormous care. "The architect of silence was the first king of Eldris, the founder of the dynasty, the person the current king was named for. I had not seen that coming. I had suspected the architect was old. I had not suspected they were specifically the founding monarch. I filed this under extremely significant and also requires immediate reassessment of everything I thought I understood." "You built the network," Cal said. "It wasn't to the king, it was to the figure at the end of the dais." "Yes." "You left messages for me in the network." A slight pause. "Also yes." "The border war 40 years ago," I said through Kale. "The treasury official. The succession dispute." The architect's eyes moved to Kale with something sharper. "You found the archive?" "Yes." "Then you know considerably more than most people who have found the archive." "Good. That means we can finally have an honest conversation." "An honest conversation," Call said, and the bitterness in his voice was the specific kind that comes from betrayal by someone you trusted. "You showed me the codex. You taught me the methods. You told me the silencing was necessary for the kingdom's protection. You didn't mention that you would allow someone to interfere." "I didn't know they would. I built the network to eventually produce a spirit. I did not know when or who." They looked at Kale. "I built in the possibility. I could not build in the certainty. These things emerge when conditions are right. And the conditions were apparently a 17-year-old boy with no magical talent and a dead IT specialist from another world. I know what you were. The world you came from exists in a different layer of the structure. Your kind of network is more advanced than mine. I have been watching your world's development for some time. You understand information infrastructure in ways this world is not yet. That's why you built the capability for a network spirit into the system, Kale said slowly. You wanted the knowledge your world didn't have yet. Is that a problem? Kale asked. No, it is interesting. A pause that felt weighted with 4 centuries of patience. The immediate question now is what happens next. Call's plan is finished completely. The council corruption will be formally addressed. The network will need new security frameworks that account for the existence of a spirit inhabiting it. They looked at the king. Your Majesty will need advice on all of this from someone who understands it. The king had been standing very still during this exchange in the manner of someone processing information faster than they showed. You have been doing it secretly, the king said. From now on, the architect said, perhaps not so secretly. Call was still standing at the center of the dais, surrounded by the darkened crystals. He had not tried to flee or to fight. He was a man watching everything he had built and planned for decades simply end. The quality of his stillness was painful to observe. Gone in 30 seconds, when a 17-year-old boy touched a master crystal and reversed the preparation sequence. Call, the king said, not unkindly. What you found was real. The network was vulnerable. Your diagnosis was correct. Your solution was wrong. Taking control for yourself is not security. It is a different kind of vulnerability. Call looked at the king for a long moment. Then he looked at Kale, then at the space around Kale where I existed. More effectively than you could have, I said through Kale. I don't have personal interests to protect. I don't have a family to advantage. I don't have a political position to maintain. I'm infrastructure. The network's security is the only goal I have that matters. Call closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something in his face had changed. Not broken. Something else. The king had Call taken into custody, quietly, without the theatrical disgrace that would have been politically satisfying but practically counterproductive. The 3 council members who had been present were also detained. The 2 who had been absent and were part of the gambling ring were flagged for mourning. By the time the assembly hall was secured and documented and the immediate crisis was contained, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The architect had not moved from the chair at the end of the dais through any of this, patient in the way of someone who had been patient for 4 centuries. You are my ancestor, the king said slowly, feeling out every word of it. 8 generations removed, the architect confirmed, give or take. You built this kingdom. I gave it a foundation. The people who came after built what it became. I merely made sure it didn't fall. And now it has something I couldn't give it when I started. A living intelligence inside the network. They looked at Kale, who was standing quietly to one side, having understood that this moment belonged to the king. To be what it already is, Kale said, part of the network, able to see and hear, a resource for the people who need honest information. Not a weapon, not a tool of power, just the thing that carries information and can be asked questions by the right people. The king looked at the space where I was for a long moment. And in exchange for being part of this kingdom's infrastructure, except the ones that shouldn't be kept secret at all, yes, except precisely those. The king thought about this the way kings do. Not quickly, not dramatically, with the weight of a person who understands that the decision they are making will outlast them. Then we have an arrangement, he said finally. He didn't extend his hand, he inclined his head. The gesture of a king acknowledging an equal. I did something I had never done before. Using every crystal in the hall simultaneously, I shaped the resonance into something like a nod in return. Not fear. Something more complicated than fear. The recognition that the world was larger and stranger than anyone had told him. Coyle found Lyra and Solon both waiting in the corridor directly outside the assembly hall doors. They had been standing there for hours. Both of them had the expression of people who have been waiting in ignorance and are prepared for almost anything. It's done, Kale said. Call? Lyra asked. Detained. The council members will be by morning. The network is secure. He paused. Also, we found out that the founder of the kingdom is still alive and has been running things from the background for 4 centuries. Solon looked at the ceiling of the corridor in a way that suggested she was recalibrating her entire academic career. 4 centuries of observed historical development, she said finally, in a tone that was somewhere between professional anguish and academic ecstasy. The gaps in the record, the missing documents, the systematic acquisition of historical texts. Yes, Kyle said simply. She looked at him with the expression of a scholar who has just been handed the key to the most important archive in history. What happens now? Lyra asked. She was more practical than Solon in the way of someone who grew up in political households. Now the council is reconstituted. The gambling ring evidence goes through formal channels. Your father presents the full case. And what about you? She asked. And us specifically? Kale looked at the space where I existed in our shared awareness. We stay here. That's you, I said. You're good at that. We're good at that, he corrected. Which was fair. The next 2 weeks were not quieter. I want to be clear about that. They were differently loud. The council dissolution and reconstitution was a political event of the first magnitude. Every noble family in the kingdom had opinions. Most of those opinions were communicated through crystal networks. All of those communications passed through me. I maintained very careful and deliberately chosen boundaries about what I monitored actively and what I allowed to pass without my attention. I had rules I set for myself. Active monitoring required a reason, a threat, a request from the king through Kale. Everything else was privacy. The merchant's conversation with his wife, the soldier's letter home, the student's confessions to a friend, those were not mine. I let them pass and did not read them, not because I couldn't, because choosing not to was the point. I had spent enough time as the dead IT guy who had watched that distinction collapse in the real world. I was not going to recreate it here. Duke Thorne's formal presentation of the corruption evidence went to the king's court the morning after the arrest. It was thorough. It was supported by documentation that could not be questioned. The 3 council members present in the assembly hall had already provided confessions. 2 more members who had been involved in the gambling ring were removed from their positions within the week. An interim body was appointed to govern magical affairs during the reconstitution. The architect provided advice. The king made decisions. I watched all of it through the crystal network and tried very hard not to have opinions about specific candidates. I mostly succeeded. Mostly. There were 2 nominees for the reconstituted council who had communication records I found concerning. I told Kale. Kale told the king through Lyra's father, who had become the primary conduit for that kind of information. The nominees were quietly reconsidered. Not me making decisions. Not Kale making decisions. Just ensuring that the people whose job it was to make decisions had accurate information. Simple in principle, harder in practice. But most worthwhile things are. The architect proved to be exactly what they had implied they were. A very old and very patient person who had seen almost everything. They took up residence in the academy at Professor Solin's invitation, officially as a visiting scholar of historical magical development. Solin could barely contain herself. She had approximately 1,700 years' worth of research questions, and the source was sitting in her office. The architect answered questions with the patience of someone who had been answering questions for 4 centuries, which they had. Kale visited them once in the first week after everything settled. I was curious about what they would say to each other directly. The architect looked at Kale for a long moment when he sat down. You adapted faster than I projected, they said. We figured it out quickly, Kale said simply, because we were already both the same essential kind of person long before we ever met. The architect tilted their head. What kind is that? The kind who understood how things worked and got no credit for it. A long considered pause followed. Yes, the architect said quietly. I suppose that is ultimately what it comes down to. Another pause. I want to ask you something, Kale said. The network. You built it to eventually produce a spirit, but you also built the archive. The architect looked at the middle distance for a moment, because I knew that information was the only thing that outlasted power. Armies disband, kingdoms fall, families die out, but a conversation recorded is a conversation that happened permanently. You wanted a record, Kale said. I wanted proof, the architect corrected, that all of it had been real, that the people were real. I processed that for a while. 4 centuries of documenting human behavior because documentation was the only immortality that mattered. Not for the powerful, for everyone. Every merchant's argument, every lover's quarrel, every stupid mistake and quiet kindness. All of it preserved in the base structure of a network that ran through a dead IT guy who had become something else. Something stranger and more useful than either of its component parts had been separately. Kale was quiet on the walk back from the architect's office. I gave him the silence. He had earned it. What do you mean? Long term, the council crisis is resolved. The network is secure. We have an arrangement with the king. But we're still first-year students at the Royal Academy, and I'm 17, and we have a lot of time ahead of us. I've been thinking about that, I said. What have you been thinking? And presumably similar problems, Kale said, following the thought quickly. Similar corruption, similar people trying to take control. I want the network to be what it's supposed to be, I said. Not just for one kingdom, for everyone who uses crystals. That's ambitious. The architect built it for one kingdom and then spent 4 centuries watching. I'm not built for watching. No, you really aren't, Kale agreed with certainty. You're built for doing. He looked at the tall stack of books on the table in front of him. I have the notes of every professor who has ever taught that course archived in the network going back 20 years. Of course you do. He opened the top book anyway. We're doing this properly, no shortcuts. Even with infinite shortcuts available, especially then. He looked at the first page. The architect spent 4 centuries doing this. We have at least that long. You think we'll live 4 centuries? He looked at the empty air directly beside him where I existed. I think if anyone in any world is going to figure out how, it's going to be us. 4 centuries of possibility stretching ahead. Every crystal in an expanding network. Every secret waiting to be relevant. Every kingdom, every family, every person who sent a message, trusting it, would go unread, eventually crossing paths with us. We should probably tell Lyra and Solon about the expansion plan, I said. Eventually. After the resonance theory examination. He turned the page. After the examination. Outside the library window, the Academy's crystal towers caught the morning light and scattered it in patterns nobody had designed. 3 days after the Assembly Hall confrontation, I discovered something in the network that changed the shape of everything going forward. Not a threat, not a crisis. Something quieter and in some ways more significant than either of those things would have been. I found a person who had been listening to me. Not to crystal communications in general, specifically to me, to the patterns I made when I moved through the network actively. Someone had been mapping those traces for weeks, building a profile of how I moved, where I was most active, what I paid attention to. The pattern of the mapping was precise and methodical, not panicked, not aggressive, careful, patient, professional. I backtracked through the mapping pattern and found its origin. Not in the kingdom, somewhere to the east, a different crystal network entirely, a different kingdom's infrastructure, which I could read because crystal networks, as it turned out, didn't stop at borders, the way rivers connect underground before they surface miles apart. The network had branches I hadn't found yet because I hadn't been looking. This was significant. If I could reach into other kingdoms' crystal networks from here, I could hear far more than I had been hearing. And if someone in another kingdom was already tracking my patterns, I was already known somewhere beyond Valdris's borders. I told Kale. He was in the middle of the resonance theory examination he had insisted we take properly without shortcuts. How far does the network reach? He asked through our connection during what was supposed to be a thinking pause. I don't know yet. I've only mapped Valdris thoroughly, but the connections exist. The architecture supports it. The architect built it to be expandable, Kale said quietly. Not a question by then. He understood how the architect thought. 4 centuries, I said. At their pace. We might do it in a decade if we're smart about the expansion. And the person tracking you, are they a threat? I thought about the pattern of their observation. No, they're curious. The way I was curious when I first found Kale's family crystals. They found something unusual and they're mapping it. Someone like us, Kale said, in a different kingdom. Possibly. Or someone who works for people who want to understand what unusual means. He finished writing his examination answer, set down the pen, looked at the ceiling for a moment. After the examination, he said, we find out who they are. After the examination, I agreed, which was completely fair. We did have deeply concerning levels of theoretical knowledge for first years. That assessment was accurate. Lyra found us in the library the same afternoon with the look of someone who had information they were itching to share. My father's intelligence network picked something up this morning. A formal delegation from the kingdom of Serath is coming to Valdris. Coming for what purpose? Kale asked. Officially to congratulate the king on the council reconstitution. Politically stable Valdris is good for Eastern trade. Unofficially, Lyra smiled, the Serath royal family has its own magical governance issues. They may be looking for how Valdris solved theirs. And looking at the person who helped solve them, Kale said. She nodded. You're becoming known, Kale? We, he said. Both of us. She looked at the air beside him. Yes, both of you. I had already started mapping the Serath crystal network in the time we'd been talking, reaching through the underground connections I'd found. 4 separate factions within the magical governance structure, each with their own communication networks, each convinced the others were enemies, no single corruption. A systemic dysfunction where nobody had enough information to trust anyone else, a kingdom paralyzed by mutual suspicion. I could fix that, not the human part, not the politics, but the information part, the thing underneath the politics. If everyone in Serath could trust that their communications were private, that no faction was listening to the others, they might be able to talk. That was a different application of what I was than anything I'd done in Valdris. Not catching corruption, protecting privacy, creating the conditions where the corruption had less room to grow because people could communicate honestly without fear. The Serath delegation, I said to Kale, we should be present at those meetings. In what capacity? As whatever capacity gets us access to their crystal network infrastructure. He thought about this. We chose it, I said, the moment we made the arrangement with him. Fair, yes, we chose it. Lyra was watching this exchange in the way she did when she knew we were talking internally. waiting patiently. "The Serath delegation," Kale said to her. "Can your father ensure we're included in the relevant meetings?" "Almost certainly. He's part of the welcoming committee." "What are you thinking?" He looked at me. "That Serath's problems are different from Valdris's," I said. He relayed it. "The corruption here was centralized. One person, one plan. Serath is fragmented, multiple factions, mutual distrust. The problem there is systemic, not individual." "And the solution is different," Lyra said slowly. "Not exposing a bad actor, something else. They can negotiate without fear of being overheard." She looked at the air around Kale with something approaching wonder. "You can do that. Make their communications actually private." "From everyone except me," I said through Kale. "But I won't listen unless there's a reason that serves the network's stability rather than any particular faction's interest." "Can you actually guarantee that to them?" she asked with calm precision. It was a direct question, and it deserved a completely direct answer. Lyra was quiet for a full moment after that. "You just gave the most genuinely honest answer about power I've ever heard from anyone." "I've been thinking about it since the assembly hall," I said. "Call's answer to the network vulnerability was to make himself the trusted authority. His logic wasn't wrong. A trusted authority is more secure than no authority. His mistake was thinking the trust should be in him. In a system where I operate by stated principles rather than personal discretion. And if you break the principles, then Kale informs the king directly. The arrangement ends immediately. The network continues on without me as any kind of active presence." "You'd lose everything," Lyra said. "I'd lose the ability to act," I said. "The network stays, the information stays. I just become background again. Losing the ability to act is not the same thing as losing everything that matters. It just means the job has been done correctly." "We have," he said. The "we" was honest, and she heard it as honest. Something in her expression settled into something more permanent. "All right," she said after a moment of genuine consideration. "Let's go to those Serath meetings, then." Let's go to the Serath meetings. The delegation arrived on a Thursday. 6 people, 3 officials, 2 mages, 1 person who was introduced as an advisor. I watched the advisor through the palace crystals during the formal greeting ceremony and felt the same absence I had felt with the 5th person in the assembly hall. The advisor was very carefully dressed in clothing that would be appropriate in Serath, but not draw attention in Valdris. They moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who had been making themselves unremarkable for a very long time. I watched them through every crystal in the reception hall simultaneously, and then I felt something unexpected. They could feel me the way I could feel them. We were aware of each other in the way that 2 networks become aware of overlap. The advisor's eyes moved across the room and stopped at a specific point. The point where Kale was standing. Not at Kale specifically, at the space around Kale where I was most concentrated at that moment. Their eyes stayed fixed on that precise point for exactly 3 seconds. Then they moved on across the room. Professionally, without visible reaction. But I had felt it. The moment of recognition. Like 2 people who speak the same rare language hearing the other use a phrase. Different. Not a network spirit inhabiting a person. Something else entirely, but old, very old, and aware of what I am. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing yet. Wait. Observe. Well, let them make the first move if they're going to make one." The formal dinner that evening was the kind of event that looks relaxed and is actually work. Everyone in the room was simultaneously being polite and extracting information and managing impressions. Classic court dinner. I monitored every crystal in the dining hall. 17 private exchange devices, 6 official recording crystals, 2 personal stones. The side conversations were more interesting. The Serath officials were genuinely curious about the council reconstitution. Through a small personal crystal belonging to one of the officials, I heard a fragment of conversation that caught my attention. Unless there was someone with full network visibility coordinating. Full network visibility is impossible. The architecture prevents it. The architecture was designed before anyone thought to look for ghosts in the infrastructure. Ghosts in the infrastructure. They had a term for it, which meant it wasn't a new concept to them. I held that thought. Someone in Serath had thought about network spirits before I had appeared, which meant either this had happened before somewhere else, or someone in Serath had been thinking theoretically about the possibility for long enough to have vocabulary for it. Which was not surprising, since I was now fairly certain they were deliberately avoiding crystal communication entirely. After dinner, the formal delegation retired to guest quarters. The Serath advisor took a different route, through a garden I had no crystals in. A deliberate choice of path. They knew where the crystals were. Kale and I had a conversation about whether to follow. I voted yes. He voted yes. The vote was unanimous by definition. He went to the garden. Alone. His footsteps quiet on the path. The night was clear. The academy towers were lit in the distance. You found me in the garden, Kale said. He didn't phrase it as a question. You arranged to be found, the advisor replied. Yes, I arranged it. That's sensible of you. Direct contact significantly reduces the risk of misunderstanding. What would be misunderstood? The advisor looked at him with eyes that had the same quality as the architect's, age without the expected weight of age. Concern about what specifically? About what moved through it, what disrupted a 40-year plan in 30 seconds, about what is still actively moving through it even now. They looked at Kale with complete steadiness. About you specifically, and what travels with you. My name is Kale Varen, he said. I know, and you carry a network spirit that emerged from your resonance crystal infrastructure. We have been expecting something very much like this to eventually happen for approximately 150 years now. Where? I said through Kale. In what kingdom? The advisor smiled, the first genuine expression they had shown. In any kingdom large enough and connected enough for the network to achieve sufficient complexity. Valdris was a candidate, so is Serath. So are 4 other kingdoms in the Eastern Territories. You've been watching all of them, Kale said. We have been watching all of them. Why? What happens when a network spirit emerges? We don't fully know, the advisor said honestly. The theory is that a sufficiently complex information network eventually develops something like awareness, like purpose. What kind of something? The advisor reached into a pocket and produced a small crystal, absolutely neutral, no resonant signature. A connection, they said, to networks in other kingdoms, not the underground structural connections that already exist. A conscious, deliberate connection between network spirits that have emerged or will emerge. You think there will be others, Kale said. We think it is inevitable. Complexity increases. Awareness follows. Not the advisor's people. Someone with a different agenda. Someone who had thought about what a network of network spirits could do, and had decided that the answer to that question was a threat rather than an opportunity. Who is looking? I asked through Kale. The advisor was quiet for a moment. An organization older than any current kingdom. They have been managing information networks since before the Resonance Crystal era. They have a name for themselves, this organization. They call themselves the Silence. I went completely and instantly still inside Kale. The architect of Silence had been working directly against the Silence for centuries. Vera had been working against them through the identity of V, and Call had been a tool the Silence had shaped without his knowledge, using his genuine concern about network security as a lever, giving him the methods, pointing him at the goal, letting him believe the plan was his, because a true believer is a better instrument than a hired agent. The Silence created Call's plan, I said. Not directly, the advisor said, but yes, they provided the Codex reconstruction. A controlled network is more useful to them than a free one. Useful for what? Control of all information across all connected kingdoms. They've been working toward this for longer than I can fully document, since before the current era of crystal communication, since before the Resonance Crystal era, Cal said. Yes, since before. I thought about what the architect had said. Information was the only thing that outlasted power. The Silence had reached the same conclusion, same diagnosis, opposite response, the oldest kind of disagreement. How many kingdoms do they currently have influence in? The advisor looked at the neutral crystal in their hand. That is the question we have been trying to answer for 50 years. We don't have anywhere near a full picture of their reach. That's precisely why we need the network spirits. You see things that we simply cannot. We have people, resources, historical records, but we cannot be everywhere at once. I can, I said through Kale. Yes, the advisor said simply. That is precisely why we came to Valdris. Give me a week, he said, to think, to talk to the people I work with, to decide. Of course, the advisor said. We have been patient for 150 years. A week is nothing. They left the garden the way they had arrived, quietly, without crystals, without traces. Kyle sat on the bench for a while after they left. I sat with him in the way I had learned to sit with him in silence. The Silence, he said eventually, has been managing information networks since before crystals existed. Yes, and they're in multiple kingdoms. Multiple kingdoms we don't have a map of yet. And there might be other network spirits emerging or already existing elsewhere. Also, yes. And we have a week to decide whether to take a connection to an organization we know almost nothing about. But I also think that connecting to an organization because they asked us to connect is not the same as understanding who they are. We need to know more before we decide. He nodded. Who could tell us? I thought about it. There was exactly one person I knew of who had been operating in this space long enough to have context. The architect, I said. They've been working against the silence for 4 centuries. They know more than anyone. He was not wrong. The architect opened the door to their academy quarters before Kale had finished knocking, as if they had been expecting us, which, knowing what we now knew about them, they probably had. The advisor from the Sarath delegation, the architect said. Yes, I saw them arrive. What do you know about them? Come in, they said. This will take a while. The architect's quarters at the academy were not what anyone would expect from a 400-year-old founder of a kingdom. No artifacts, no portraits, no shelves crowded with evidence of centuries lived. Just books, a desk, 2 chairs, and a small window. Sit down, the architect said, not unkindly, the tone of someone who has spent a very long time making people feel comfortable enough to talk honestly. Kale sat. I arranged myself in the way I had learned to arrange myself when conversations mattered. Fully present, fully listening. The advisor's name is Mira Denath, the architect said before either of us had asked a single question. She is approximately 200 years old. She represents an organization called the Watchers. They have been monitoring crystal network development across 6 kingdoms for the past century and a half. 2 old organizations, Kale said slowly. One that wants to control all information networks. One that wants to prevent that. And both of them have been operating in the background of multiple kingdoms for longer than any current government has existed. Yes, the architect said simply. That is an accurate summary of approximately 400 years of history. A silence. I processed this. The architect had built the network, built the Watchers to protect it, and then watched for 4 centuries. You built the opposition to the silence, I said. I built the response to them, the architect corrected. The silence existed before I did. How old are they? Old enough that we have no reliable record of their founding. Old enough that they predate the resonance crystal era entirely. They have been managing information and controlling its flow since before crystals existed, since before formal kingdoms existed, and before crystals. Messengers, written records, libraries. Wherever information concentrated, the silence was there. I thought about what it meant to be an organization that old with that level of consistency, the dedication required, the patience. How many people? I asked. We don't know exactly. They recruit carefully. They lose members to age, and we don't know their renewal methods. But they are numerous enough to maintain presence in at least a dozen kingdoms simultaneously. That is the minimum we can confirm. Mira is one of perhaps 30 active members spread across the 6 kingdoms we have been able to confirm presence in so far. 30 people watching 12 kingdoms, I said, against an organization of unknown size with 400 years of head start. It has been a challenging endeavor, the architect said with the particular understatement of someone who has been losing slowly for centuries. And because the silence is very good at identifying and neutralizing potential recruits before we can reach them, they found Call, I said, before you did. Yes, he was exactly the kind of person we look for. Intelligent, principled, genuinely concerned about network security. They reached him first, gave him the codex, pointed him at the goal, turned his genuine concern into their instrument. That happens more than I would like to admit, the architect said quietly. It sounded like it cost something to say. The architect looked at him with complete steadiness. You don't. Not with any real certainty. That is the most honest answer I can give. What I can tell you is that the Watcher's founding principle is that information should be free and protected from centralized control, including control by the Watchers ourselves. We do not want to own the network. We want it to remain ownable by absolutely no one. That is structurally different from the Silence's goal. They want to own it. We want to ensure that no one can. We are asking you to work alongside us, not for us. The difference is significant. Is it always honored? Kale asked. What happened to them? They were removed from the organization, sometimes by me personally. The weight of that phrase was considerable. 4 centuries of personally removing people who forgot what they were supposed to be doing, I said. That sounds exhausting. Not because you are powerful, though you are, because you established your own principles before anyone asked you to. The rules you set for yourself about what to monitor and what to leave private. I observed those independently. Nobody told you to create those boundaries. You built them because they were right. The architect looked between Kale and the space I occupied. Kale was quiet for a moment. I was processing the conversation and also watching the Sarath delegation's quarters through the palace crystals. Mira Denath was sitting in her room writing by hand. No crystals, no magical communication device, a pen and paper and a lamp. Whatever she was writing would leave this kingdom in a physical letter carried by a physical courier, completely invisible to me. That was a form of trust. She was conducting her own communication in a way I couldn't read, demonstrating that she understood boundaries. We need to make a decision, Kale said to the architect, about connecting to the Watchers, working with Mira's network. Yes, the architect said. You do? What would you recommend? I would recommend trusting your own judgment about people. You assessed Call correctly in the assembly hall under pressure. You assessed Lyra correctly. You even assessed me correctly from the beginning. Trust the same process you used for those assessments. You have better information than any of us have ever had at this stage. Judgment is what you do with information. You have demonstrated that you know what to do with it. Kale stood up. Give us the week we asked Mira for, he said to the architect. We'll have an answer by then. Of course, the architect said. Kale walked to the door, stopped, turned back once. The silence. They know about me, about us. They were behind Call's plan. Yes. Are they going to try again? With someone else? Some other approach to taking the network? The architect met his eyes. They always try again, they said. They have been trying for 400 years. The question is not whether they try. The question is whether we are ready when they do. Kale nodded once, then we left. The Watchers versus the Silence, he said eventually. 2 old organizations, and we're being asked to pick a side. We already picked a side, I said. We picked it the night we stopped Call. We just didn't have a name for it yet. Protecting the network from being owned. Yes. He was quiet again. That's not the same as joining the Watchers, while also attending classes and trying to understand the Seraph situation and figuring out what the architect's long game actually is. He laughed quietly in the corridor. When you put it that way, it sounds very much like we need help. We need help, I said simply and directly. We need help that respects what we are. That doesn't try to direct us or use us. And you think the Watchers do that. I think Mira came here and sat in a garden without crystals and asked us honestly instead of trying to recruit us through manipulation. Someone who respects your privacy when they don't have to is worth more than someone who promises to in a contract. He stopped walking, stood in the middle of the corridor looking at the ceiling. All right, he said. We work with them. With conditions, I said. Obviously with conditions. What conditions? They don't direct where we look. Ever. We share what we find. We don't act on their behalf without independent judgment that acting is right. And if they try to use what we find in ways we consider wrong, we withdraw immediately. No negotiation. We found Mira the next morning in the Academy gardens again. She was sitting with a cup of tea and a book in a spot with no crystals nearby. She looked up when Kale approached. The expression of someone who had been waiting but had learned patience long ago. We have conditions, Kale said without preamble. She closed her book. Tell me. He did, all of them. Clearly, without softening anything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. A pause. Almost, I said through Kale. The founding charter uses more formal language, she said. Something like humor in her voice. Do you accept them? Kale asked. Yes, the Watchers accept them. I personally guarantee them. She reached into her pocket and produced the same neutral crystal she had shown us the night before. This is a connection crystal. It links to a network of similar crystals held by Watchers in each kingdom. It operates outside the standard resonance crystal infrastructure. The Silence cannot monitor it. Can I asked. She looked at the space where I was with complete directness. We assumed you could. We built it expecting that. She placed the neutral crystal carefully on the stone bench between them. Kyle looked at it for a full moment. Then he picked it up. The connection was immediate. A different kind of network. Older architecture, more deliberate. Less sprawling than the resonance crystal system. 30 nodes across 6 kingdoms. 30 people who had each made a version of the same choice we had just made. I reached through the new connections carefully and deliberately, gently, announcing myself through resonance rather than simply arriving without any warning. They've been waiting for you, Kyle said quietly. For whatever I would be, I said. Yes. Mira watched us with the expression of someone witnessing something they had worked toward for a very long time. What do you know about the Silence's current operations? Kale asked her. She took a breath. More than we did last month, less than we need to. She pulled out a small folded paper. Physical, written by hand. We have now confirmed Silence presence in 7 kingdoms we know of. Valdris was one of them. Sarath is another. The other 5 are on this list. Kale looked at the list. I read it through his eyes. 5 kingdoms. 3 of them shared borders. 2 were connected by major trade routes. They're creating a mesh, I said, connecting the networks they control. When enough of them are linked, they won't need a central broadcast point. They can push the silencing through multiple entry points simultaneously. No single kingdom can stop it alone. Mira looked at Kale sharply. How long have you known that? I didn't. I just worked it out now from the map. She folded the paper. Then you understand why the timeline matters. If they complete the mesh before we can disrupt it, every crystal network in every affected kingdom locks simultaneously to their control. There is no practical recovery point after that. Yes, I understand exactly that. How long to complete the mesh? Kale asked. Our estimate is 3 to 5 months, depending on how far along they are in Sarath and the other 4 kingdoms. 3 to 5 months, shorter than the timeline we had started with. The silence was accelerating just as Call had accelerated. He relayed this to Mira. Her expression confirmed it. We believe so. Our intelligence from the other kingdoms is fragmentary. The silence is very good at removing our people before they can report. She said it without drama, just fact. It had the weight of loss behind it. We can change that, I said through Kale. What I can do in Valdris, I can do through the connection crystal in the other kingdoms. Not with the same depth, not immediately. The Sarath network is the largest and most complex. That one will take time. Human observers always leave traces that can be found and followed. Networks don't notice being read by the thing that already is the network. Mira looked at us with an expression I had learned to recognize, the expression of someone recalculating what was possible. The Founding Watcher built the connection crystal network specifically to give a network spirit access to multiple kingdoms, she said slowly. What does it mean? Kale asked her. It means you can see the whole board, she said, all of it, simultaneously. The silence has been operating in darkness because no single observer could see their full operation. You can. Yes, I said. That is exactly what it means. A pause. Start with Sarath, I said. It's the largest connected network, and they know a spirit exists in Valdris. If they have an agent in Sarath's governance structure, they will be pushing that agent to accelerate. I need to read that network now. This is linked to the Sarath node. Our watcher there is a woman named Daya. She's been in position for 6 years. She's been watching a specific pattern of unusual crystal traffic she can't fully explain. You might be able to explain it. Kale took the second crystal. I reached through it immediately. The Sarath crystal network was enormous. 3 times the geographic coverage of Valdris. More nodes, more connections, more complexity. And in that complexity, exactly the pattern I had been looking for. Traffic that looked ordinary on the surface. But the timing was the signature. Pulses at specific intervals between specific nodes that formed a pattern beneath the content. The same pattern I had seen in Call's testing sequences before he accelerated the silencing timeline. Someone in Sarath was testing the network architecture, probing its limits, preparing for a broadcast. They're further along in Sarath than Mira knew, I told Kale. He kept his voice level when he relayed it. Mira's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly on her teacup. How much further? The testing pattern I'm seeing is more advanced than what Call had when I first identified him. Weeks further at minimum. Give me time. I pushed deeper through the Sarath network, tracing back through the timing pattern to its source. It was harder than reading Valdris. The network was less familiar to me. The architecture had subtle differences, but the fundamental principle was the same. Everything that travels through the network touches the network. And I was the network. The Sarath Institute of Historical Studies, a library, a research center, a public institution with unrestricted access. The silence is operating out of a library in Sarath's capital, I told Kale. He told Mira. Her expression finally broke into something sharp. The Institute. Daya has been watching it. She thought it was connected but couldn't prove the link. The link is the timing pattern. For the next 3 hours, Kale sat in the academy garden while I worked. Solon brought him breakfast. Lyra came and sat without asking questions. Mira stayed. I mapped the Sarath operation piece by piece. Every node that connected to the Institute's timing pattern. Every relay in the chain. What emerged was not one operation, but 2. The visible operation in the Institute, and a second one running parallel through Sarath's trading district. 2 separate preparation chains. A redundant system. If one was disrupted, the other could complete the broadcast alone. They had been building redundancy into their operations, probably for decades. Every time someone stopped them, they adapted. This was not an organization that could be beaten by finding and removing one piece. They had planned for that. You couldn't just expose the Institute. They would activate the trading district chain before the exposure could be acted on. People the silence didn't know about. People who couldn't be preemptively removed. People who could move the moment I gave the word. Mira, I said through Kale. The Watchers in Sarath. How many and where exactly? She looked at him carefully. Daya and 2 others. They're positioned near the Institute. I need them repositioned. 1 near the Institute, 1 near the trading district, 1 at a 3rd location I'll identify. What's at the 3rd location? I don't know yet, but there will be one. The silence builds in triangles. I've seen the pattern in Valdris's archive. This was working with the Watchers, not being directed by them, directing alongside them. The distinction was real, and it mattered. Lyra had been listening. She spoke up quietly. My father has contacts in Sarath, trading partners, people who owe the Thorn family significant favors. If you need additional people on the ground who aren't watchers and aren't known to the Silence. She looked at Kale evenly. Yes, he said. We might need that. How much time do we have? I ran the progression of the testing pattern forward. Lyra nodded once, stood. I'll contact my father. Physical courier only? She was already walking before she finished speaking. The strategic clarity of watching the right people understand the same problem simultaneously was something I found deeply satisfying. Not because of the power in it, because coordination between people with different capabilities is genuinely elegant, like code running cleanly, like a network finding the optimal path between 2 points, satisfying in a structural way. Mira repositioned the Watchers in Sarath, according to my guidance. Daya confirmed the new positions through the connection crystal. Lyra's father activated 3 trading contacts in Sarath's capital, people with legitimate reasons to be in multiple districts who would draw no attention. The architect provided historical context on the Silence's operational patterns from 4 centuries of observation. The 3rd location emerged on day 3. Not a building, a junction point in the crystal relay network itself, a node that connected to both the Institute chain and the trading district chain simultaneously. The convergence point. This was the real broadcast location. Not either preparation chain individually, but the single convergence point where both chains were designed to merge. If you disrupted the preparation chains, but left the junction node operational, the Silence could rebuild and try again. I need to be able to reach the Sarath network directly when it's time, I told Kale on the evening of day 4. Not just read it, act on it. Disrupt the junction node from here while the people on the ground handle the other 2. Can you actually do that? Reach through the Watcher connection crystal into a completely foreign network and act on it directly from here? I thought about what the architect had built. The connection crystal network designed for exactly this purpose. I inhabited the resonance crystal network because I came through it. The connection network uses the same foundations. I think, I said carefully, that I can extend into it, not as completely as I inhabit Valdris's network, but enough to act on a single node. Think or no? Kale asked. Think. I haven't tried it yet. When would be a good time to test it? Before we need it to work in a crisis situation would be optimal. We tested it carefully that same night, with Mira's full knowledge and Daya's direct cooperation positioned at the Sarath end of the connection. It was like reaching through water. Possible, but requiring more effort than moving through air. The sensation was distinct, but manageable. I moved a single low-priority message crystal in a Sarath relay station from active to standby, the smallest possible action. Daya confirmed the change from her position in Sarath's capital. It had worked. I could act in Sarath from Valdris, a network spirit acting across kingdoms without being physically present in either crystal network simultaneously. The architect had built the possibility. I had found it by accident and confirmed it by intention. That felt right somehow. Day 5. Mira received a message through the connection crystal from a watcher in one of the other kingdoms on the list. The Silence had moved aggressively in a kingdom called Forthen. Not another test this time. A full and actual broadcast attempt had been made. The Silence's broadcast required a specific minimum of network complexity to propagate. Forthen's network was too simple, too small, but the attempt had been made, which meant the Silence was testing not just individual networks, but which ones were ready. They were looking for the easiest path. The network complex enough to carry the silencing, but not complex enough to resist it. Valdris had been the first attempt. Stopped. Sarath was the current focus. There were 3 others on the list. One kingdom under complete information control is enough to destabilize all the others if they play it carefully. Mira heard this, and her expression was the expression of someone who had known a terrible thing was coming and was watching it arrive. How long have you known that was their actual overall strategy? Kale asked her gently, carefully. Since we saw what happened in Forthen, she said. 6 kingdoms, 2 with active operations, 1 tested and failed, 3 still being assessed, and a network spirit who could see all of it. The picture was uncomfortable, but it was the kind of picture you could act on. Incomplete pictures lead to incomplete responses. This picture was complete enough. We need to act in Sarath before they're ready, I said. Not wait for them to attempt the broadcast. Disrupting their preparation is better than disrupting their attempt. An attempt might succeed partially, even if we stop it. This is your decision, she said. You and the network spirit. The Watchers provide support. We don't direct. She was honoring the conditions, visibly, in a moment where the temptation to direct must have been significant. I noticed it. I filed it under evidence of good faith. Kyle looked at the space where I was. Ready? He asked. Ready, I said. Signal Daya, he told Mira. We go in 48 hours. The The 48 hours were spent in the kind of quiet, intensive preparation that looks like nothing from the outside. Mira coordinated with Daya and the other watchers. Lyra's father's contacts confirmed their positions in Sarath's capital. The architect provided us one final critical piece of information before the operation began: the name of the Silence's primary operative in Sarath, a woman named Sira Vaughn, officially the director of the Sarath Institute of Historical Studies, publicly respected. Privately, the architect of the Sarath operation. Sira Vaughn had been in position for 11 years, building the Institute's reputation, cultivating connections, preparing the ground. On the morning of the operation, I reached through the Watcher connection and settled into the Sarath network as deeply as I could manage. It was still water rather than air. Still required sustained effort, but I was fully present in it now, reading and ready to act. Kale sat in the restricted library with Lyra and Solon. Mira sat nearby. Everyone else was positioned where they needed to be. Standard procedure. The same thing Call had done in the archive tower, verifying readiness before the actual attempt. I waited. Let it run. Let them confirm readiness. Let them believe everything was aligned and operating correctly. Then I moved through the network with complete intention. 3 simultaneous actions across 3 completely separate locations in Sarath's crystal infrastructure. The Institute chain. I introduced a destructive resonance into the preparation sequence, like feedback in an audio system, but at the crystal level. The trading district chain. Daya acted simultaneously at my signal, a physical disruption, a crystal node physically removed from the relay. Lower tech than my approach, but equally effective. The trading district chain went dark, the junction node, the convergence point where both chains would have merged for the actual broadcast. I reached for it through the Sarath network and found it was already dormant. Without the preparation chains feeding it, there was nothing to converge. The Sarath operation ended, all 3 points simultaneously, in under 1 minute. In the restricted library, Kale looked at Lyra. "It's done," he said. She let out a breath she had apparently been holding. Sira Vaughn, the Silence's primary agent in Sarath. Daya had moved on her position simultaneously with the crystal network disruption. Clean coordination. Clean. Coordinated. The kind of operation that works because everyone understood the goal and trusted each other to execute their piece. I held the Sarath network carefully after the operation was complete, feeling it settle, feeling the disrupted nodes go quiet. Information infrastructure is like that. It doesn't care what it's used for. It's what you use it for that matters. 4 then failed on its own, 2 down by our action, 3 still being assessed. Yes. And the Silence knows they've failed twice now. They're going to change their approach. Yes. What do they do when they can't use the networks directly? I had been thinking about this since the 4th and failure. The old methods, the ones they used before the resonance crystal era existed? Yes. The ones I can't monitor, Kale said. The ones I can't monitor, I agreed. Mira had been listening. That's the next problem, she said, and it's one where the network spirit's advantage is reduced. What exactly is our advantage in the next stage, then? Kale asked her directly. She looked at him, and then deliberately at the space around him. You know who they are. You have 400 years of their operational history from the Architect's archive. The Silence's greatest advantage has always been operating in darkness. We just turned a light on inside their structure. She was right. Knowing the enemy's methods from 4 centuries of observation was a different kind of intelligence than real-time monitoring. It didn't replace what I could do in the networks, but it meant the period when they went around the networks wasn't a blind spot. It was a known pattern. What do they do next, specifically? I asked the architect that evening. They had been waiting for the question. They create narratives that serve their goals and place those narratives where influential people will encounter them and repeat them. Information control without direct network access at all. Slower than their crystal approach. Less complete, but structurally resistant to what you can do. How do we counter that? Kale asked. The architect looked at him steadily. The same way you've countered everything else. That requires people, I said. Not just network access. People in positions to receive what I know and put it where it matters. Yes, the architect said. That is the next stage of what you're building. We're building something? Kale asked. The architect looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has watched a great deal of history and recognizes a turning point. You have secured 2 kingdoms. You have disrupted the Silence's most advanced operation. You have connected the Watcher network to something it was designed to eventually find. How much longer? That depends on choices you haven't made yet, on people you haven't met, on how many kingdoms the Silence has embedded themselves in more deeply than the crystal networks can reveal, on whether the other network spirits emerge and what they choose when they do. They looked at the space where I was, on what you decide you are. Infrastructure, observer, participant, those are different things with different implications. I thought about that for a long time after we left the architect's quarters. Carl was quiet, letting me think. In the sense of the network serving the purpose it was built for, information moving freely, honestly, without obstruction. That's infrastructure, he said. With judgment, I said. The judgment part is what makes it participant. Both, he said. Infrastructure with judgment, those aren't mutually exclusive? No, they're not. We walked in silence for a moment through the academy corridors that had become familiar over weeks that felt longer. That means traveling, leaving the academy. He paused. Leaving what we've built here. We built something in Valdris, I said. Lyra, Solon, the arrangement with the king, the architect, Mira. Those aren't going anywhere. What we built here is the foundation, not the whole structure. You're saying we need to leave? I'm saying the network extends beyond Valdris, and I extend through the network. Wherever there are crystals, I can be. But being present isn't the same as being effective. Being effective requires someone who can translate what I see into action, someone in the right position. Me, Cale said. In the right kingdoms. Yes. He thought about this. We had reached the courtyard. The night was clear. The academy towers caught starlight. And then we find out how far the network reaches? And the silence? They've been operating for 400 years. They'll still be there when we're ready. But they'll be different by then. They'll have adapted to losing Valdris and Sereth. Yes, which means the next encounter will be different. Different how? I don't know yet, I said honestly. But different. They always adapt. So do we, Kyle said. He said it simply, without performance. Just a statement of fact that happened to be true. So do we, I agreed. He looked up at the towers for a moment, at the crystals catching light in the dark, at the network I inhabited extending outward in every direction, and 2 first-year academy students from a minor provincial family who had somehow ended up positioned at the precise center of all of it. The resonance theory final is in 3 days, Cale said. You have every professor's notes for the last 20 years archived? I have every note going back 20 years, yes. We're still doing it properly. No shortcuts. I know we are. A pause. I wouldn't have it any other way. He smiled. The same genuine smile I had seen exactly twice before, the kind that meant something was actually right. Somewhere in 6 kingdoms the silence was adapting, rebuilding, planning the next approach. Somewhere in those same kingdoms the Watcher network was repositioning, learning, preparing to receive what I found. And in the base structure of every crystal in the expanding network, buried 400 years deep in the architecture a long-dead IT guy now inhabited, something was settling into place. Not finished, not close to finished, but pointed in the right direction. The network carries everything, every secret, every truth, every conversation that matters and most that don't. And when it notices, the information stops being cargo and starts being something that can act on its own behalf. That's what I was. Not cargo, not infrastructure, not a tool or a weapon or a resource, the thing that the network had always been capable of becoming, given enough time and the right conditions. And a dead IT guy from another world who understood exactly what it felt like to be the thing that carried everything while no one noticed. Until now. We were noticed now, and we had work to do. The resonance theory final examination was on a Friday morning in the main examination hall with 43 other first-year students. I watched through the hall's recording crystals and felt something I hadn't expected to feel during a standardized examination. Contentment, not because of the examination itself, because of the normalcy of it, the mundane reality of 44 students and pencils and a 3-hour test. 3 weeks ago, we had been in a midnight confrontation with the first seat of the High Council in the Assembly Hall. 2 weeks ago, we had disrupted an operation in a foreign kingdom's crystal network from a garden bench in Valdris. The world's communication infrastructure ran through me, and I was monitoring a first-year examination. Both things were equally true. I had been the internet. I had been the kind of person who understood more about how things worked than anyone ever noticed. The part of me that was still Ethan Cole, dead IT guy from an unremarkable Tuesday, found this deeply and genuinely funny. Cale finished the examination 20 minutes before time was called. He checked his work. He sat quietly. He waited for the bell. The bell rang. He stood. He handed in his paper. He walked out of the examination hall into the autumn sunlight. How did it go? I asked. Fine, he said. I got the question about pre-resonance encoding theory right. Of course you did. The professor is going to wonder about that one. Professors wonder about us in general. We've given up managing that. Outside the examination hall, Lyra was waiting. She had finished her own examination an hour earlier and had clearly been spending the time thinking. She had the expression she wore when she had worked through several layers of a problem and arrived somewhere complicated. The king's advisor sent a message this morning, she said without preamble. Through my father. Physical courier. The newly reconstituted council is meeting next week for its first formal session. The king specifically wants you to be present. Unofficially, as the person whose arrangement with the network means the council's communications will never again be used against the kingdom. Kyle looked at the space where I was concentrated most. We were planning to leave Valdris after finals concluded, he said to me. We were going to be leaving to address the other kingdoms on the silences list, I said. The council meeting is in Valdris. Being present at the first meeting of the reconstituted council is not the same as staying indefinitely. No, he agreed. It isn't. He looked at Lyra. Tell the king's advisor yes. We'll be there. There's something else, she said. The architect will be attending. Officially, as a historical consultant to the new council. Oh, officially, I said, after 4 centuries of working from the background. Apparently, the midnight conversation with the king was productive. It was very productive, I confirmed. I had read the king's subsequent communications with his private secretary, the specific kind of thinking that quietly reorganizes your entire understanding of everything you have been doing and why you are doing it. He had written in a personal journal that he kept locked in a drawer with no crystal nearby. Physical, handwritten, private. I had not read it. It was private. That was the line, and I held it absolutely. But I knew it existed, and I knew it mattered. Whatever the king had worked through in those private hours before dawn had produced a man ready to be the kind of king the kingdom needed. That was the job. Not heroics, not strategy. Information moving to where it could produce better outcomes. That was the entire point. The council meeting was 5 days after the examination results came back. Kale placed second in the cohort on resonance theory. First place went to a girl named Sarah from the port city who had been studying resonance theory since she was 9 years old. Kyle told me he was glad. I believed him. He genuinely was. The council chamber was newly arranged. The old seating pattern that had favored the senior members' sightlines was gone. The king had insisted on the new arrangement. The old one, apparently, had been part of how the senior members maintained informal authority over junior ones for decades. Kale sat in an observation position along the wall. Not at the table, not a council member. Present, but not occupying space that wasn't his. The 7 new council members were an interesting selection. 3 had previous magical governance experience. 4 were appointments from outside the traditional pool. A representative from the merchant guilds, an appointment which had never happened once in the entire institution's long recorded history, and a young woman of 22 who was the first in her family to receive formal magical education and who had been assessed at rank 9. The council meeting went smoothly in the way things go smoothly when the people present are genuinely trying to do the work correctly. Just 7 people, genuinely and carefully trying to figure out how to do a very difficult job better than it had been done in 12 years. At the end of the meeting, the council chair, the retired field mage, called for closing remarks. She looked at Kale's position along the wall. We understand that the arrangement providing the network monitoring function that identified the previous council's corruption continues. It does continue, Kale said directly. The network remains monitored for active threats to kingdom security specifically. Nothing else at all. Nothing else, I said through Kale with complete steadiness. Private communications remain private. I'm not a surveillance apparatus. I am the thing that makes unauthorized surveillance by outside parties impossible to maintain. That is a fundamentally different function entirely. The chair held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Once. The nod of someone who had decided to extend trust and meant it. The meeting ended. People filed out. Kyle stood and stretched with the unself-conscious physicality of someone who had been sitting still for 2 hours. The distinction between conducting surveillance and providing protection from surveillance by others, Kale said calmly. It genuinely matters. It always matters. It is the distinction that will determine whether what you are becomes something the kingdom trusts or fears. Both outcomes are entirely possible from here. The trust version requires constant active maintenance. The fear version tends to arrive entirely on its own. Outside the council chamber, Mira was waiting. She had attended as an observer, her presence officially unacknowledged. She fell into step with Kyle as they left the building. The Watcher Network has news from the remaining 3 kingdoms on the list. 2 of them have shown the testing pattern you identified in Sarath. The 3rd hasn't yet, but the structural conditions are present. Timeline? Kale asked. The faster of the 2 is approximately 6 weeks out from a broadcast attempt, based on your Sarath calibration. The connection crystal network covers all 3, I asked. All 3 have Watcher nodes. The coverage is thinner than Sarath. 1 person per kingdom rather than 3. That's not enough for a simultaneous 3-point disruption. No, Mira agreed. We would need more people in position. More time to build the ground presence. Or a different approach entirely, Kale said. He was thinking. I could feel him thinking. What approach? I said. He was quiet for a moment, working through it. In Sarath, we disrupted the preparation chains through physical action on the ground, while I handled the convergence node remotely from Valdris. In the remaining kingdoms, we don't have enough people for the physical components. No, but the Silence's preparation chains in those kingdoms will have the same architecture, the same timing patterns. Same vulnerability points, I said, following his thought. If I can act on the convergence node in Sarath remotely, can I act on all 3 preparation chain nodes simultaneously and remotely, without requiring any physical disruption on the ground in each kingdom? I thought about this carefully. In Sarath, I had acted on 1 node while Daya's team handled 2 physical points. Through connection crystals I hadn't fully inhabited. In network architectures, I didn't know as well as Sarath. It's harder than Sarath, I said. By how much? I don't know. I haven't tried to hold 3 simultaneous remote actions. I've barely tried one. The Sarath junction node was a single clean action on a familiar target. 3 actions, 3 networks, simultaneously, less familiar architectures. That's a significant escalation. What would a test look like? Kale asked her. There are inactive relay nodes in each of the 3 kingdoms. Historical nodes, not currently in use. If the network spirit could demonstrate influence over those nodes remotely, it would tell us what's possible. How soon could we test? The connection crystals for all 3 kingdoms are already with the Watcher nodes. If you have a communication method with the local operators. I have the connection network, I said. Give me the frequencies for the local operators and I'll reach them tonight. That night in the restricted library, I reached through the Watcher connection network to all 3 kingdoms simultaneously. Not aggressive, not urgent. The same announcement through resonance approach I had used the first time. The responses were different from the Sarath experience, more cautious, less prepared for what I was. These particular Watchers had been briefed to expect eventual contact from a network spirit. Theory, however, is always very different from actuality. One of them, the Watcher in the most at-risk kingdom, sent back a response through the connection network that made Kale laugh. Over the next 2 hours, I tested reach into each of the 3 kingdoms' inactive relay nodes, carefully, one at a time. The first was clean. Same effort as Sarath. I moved the inactive node from dormant to minimal resonance and back. The local Watcher confirmed. The second was harder. The network architecture in that kingdom had evolved differently. The base structure was compatible, but the surface patterns were foreign. The third was the one that gave me pause. Something in that network structure was different at a fundamental level. Not incompatible, but different in a way I didn't immediately understand, like encountering a dialect rather than a foreign language. I could read the third network clearly enough. I could act on it in a technical sense, but I needed time to calibrate before acting with real confidence. The third kingdom needs more preparation, I told Kale. How much? A week? Maybe 2. I need to learn the network's specific patterns. Do the first 2 kingdoms simultaneously and give the third kingdom the time it actually needs to calibrate properly? Yes, that is the right sequence. Kale relayed this to Mira through the connection crystal the next morning. She listened. She asked 2 questions. She said yes. The next 3 weeks were, from the outside, unremarkable. 2 students attending classes, a scholar conducting research, a political consultant visiting the capital. From the inside, they were the most technically demanding 3 weeks I had experienced since becoming the network, building the map of each one the way I had built Valdris's map in my first weeks, node by node, pattern by pattern, connection by connection. Kale helped in the way that Kale always helped, by asking the right questions at the right moments to force clarity in my thinking. Why does the Eastern Network use a different base harmonic? Because it was built by a different school of crystal crafters. The founding mage who designed it came from a tradition that used odd number frequency relationships instead of even. What would have happened if you'd missed it? I would have acted on the wrong nodes. The disruption would have been partial. Partial disruption is worse than no disruption, I said. It alerts them without stopping them. Which is why you spent 2 weeks calibrating before acting. Yes. Good, he said simply. That was right. The operation targeting the first 2 kingdoms happened on a Wednesday evening, as the autumn sun was going down over the Valdris skyline. No dramatic preparation, no midnight meeting. Kyle sat in our dormitory room with the connection crystals in his hands. I reached through both simultaneously, feeling the strain of holding 2 foreign networks in active attention at the same time. It was harder than Sarath. The comparison I reached for was holding 2 different conversations simultaneously while doing arithmetic. Possible, not comfortable, requiring complete focus and nothing else. The first kingdom's operation took 40 seconds. The preparation chains disrupted cleanly. The convergence node went dark. Both Watcher nodes confirmed complete disruption. Both operations clean, no casualties. Both silence operations ended. Kale sat completely still for a long moment after I pulled back from both connection crystals. He looked down at his hands in the quiet. "How are you?" he asked. Not strategically, just asking. "Tired," I said. That's the right word for what I experience. It might not be exactly right, he said, but it's close enough. Yes, close enough. 2 more kingdoms secured, he said. 1 remaining. 1 remaining, and it's the complicated one. Then why haven't you said so? A pause. I thought about how to answer honestly. Because the 3rd kingdom's network has something I haven't encountered in any of the others. What? A presence. Not like me. Not a spirit. Something more like a strong resonance pattern with a consistent signature. Consistent over what period? As long as I can read the archive records. Decades. Maybe longer. Someone has been maintaining a specific resonance pattern in that network for decades. Yes, deliberately. Like someone who has been preparing that network for something specific for a very long time. He said it slowly, feeling out what it might mean. Not the same way I am. Something different. Something that predates the conditions that produced me. Silence. Is it the silence? Kyle asked. No. The signature is wrong for them. Too constant. Too settled. The silence's signatures are purposeful and directional. This is just present, like background, like the architecture of the network itself. But it's not part of the architecture? What does it do? Nothing I can detect. It just exists, resonates, maintains its pattern. And the silence's operation in that kingdom, is it aware of the presence? If it isn't reacting to it. They might simply not be able to see it at all, I said carefully. From their position outside the network, the presence is buried too deeply. But you can see it. I can see it because I'm looking from inside the network structure. They're looking from outside. Cal thought about this for a long moment. Can you communicate with it? I had been wondering the same thing. When we disrupt the silence's operation in that kingdom, he said, we'll be acting in a network where something unknown is already present. Yes, something unknown is already present and active in that network. Is that a problem for the operation? I don't know yet. It might be an advantage. If the presence is hostile to the silence's operation, it might help without being asked. Or it might react to us as another intrusion. It didn't require resolution to be tolerable. Some things were uncertain until they weren't, and forcing clarity before the moment only created false certainty. When does the silence's current testing pattern in that kingdom indicate they'll attempt the actual broadcast? Based on the progression. 10 days. And you're ready. I'm ready. Then we go in 7 days, giving us 3 days of margin. Yes, that's right. Study, he said. To himself as much as to me. Familiar rhythm. The ordinary thing that ran alongside the extraordinary. The 7 days passed. The operation in the 3rd kingdom began on a Sunday morning when the crystal network was at its lowest traffic volume. I reached through the connection crystal on Sunday morning carefully and with complete deliberateness, feeling for the presence first before attempting any action. It was there, clearer than before, the specific resonance of something old and settled and aware in ways I hadn't been certain of before. Not defensively, something more like turning toward a sound, the orientation of something that had been dormant and is now paying attention. I held myself completely still inside the network structure, not withdrawing from the contact, not advancing further, simply waiting to see what came next. The presence examined me. That is the only accurate description. A period of mutual observation in which neither of us acted. Then it did something I had not anticipated. It showed me something, not in words, not in any kind of message, in the network structure itself. A section of the network it drew my attention to, not threatening it, not protecting it, pointing at it with the clarity of something that wants to make sure you've seen what it's seen. It's actively showing me the target, I told Cale urgently through our connection. He went completely still in the dormitory room, listening carefully. It knows what we're here to do? It seems to, or it reached the same conclusion independently. Is it going to help? A moment. The presence in the network shifted again, moving, not aggressively, moving toward the convergence node. Yes, I said with as much certainty as I had. I believe it's going to help us. Then let it help. And simply act alongside it. Yes, same way we work with Mira. Same way we work with the Watchers. You don't have to understand someone fully to cooperate. He was right. He was frequently right about the things that mattered most. I stopped trying to analyze and started moving. I watched the presence work and understood in that specific moment exactly why the network architecture in that kingdom had felt fundamentally different to me. The presence was old, very old, older than the resonance crystal era. It had been here before the first crystals were installed. It had been here when the crystals arrived and had simply absorbed them, made them part of itself, adapted to the new infrastructure without losing what it was, something that predated me by what might have been centuries, something that had found its own way to inhabit information networks before anyone had a name for it. The operation completed, The third kingdom's silence operation was ended. All 6 kingdoms on the list were now secure. All 3 remaining on the original 5 now addressed. Combined with Forthin's natural failure, the silence's mesh was broken. The Watcher node in the third kingdom sent confirmation through the connection crystal. Clean operation. Silence agents in custody. And then the presence in that kingdom's network did one final thing. It sent something through the connection crystal to me. The closest translation I could find in any language I knew was something between hello and I have been waiting. I sent the same pattern back, not as a response, as an acknowledgement, a recognition that mattered more than anything strategic. Kale felt the exchange through our connection without understanding the content. What was that? He asked. The presence in that kingdom's network, I said. It introduced itself. What's its name? The silence will adapt. They always do. And we'll need to be in multiple places. We'll find ways. The Watcher network. Yes. The Architect's knowledge. Yes. Lyra's family connections? Yes. Each other, he said. Obviously, I said. That one was never in question. He set down the connection crystals, stood, stretched, the ordinary movements of a person at the end of a long day. Outside the dormitory window, the Academy's tall crystal towers were catching the very last of the evening light, scattering it in small directions. The network hummed, constant, invisible, carrying the conversations and the secrets and the ordinary noise of an entire kingdom. Something that had once been an unremarkable IT guy on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. Something that was now the thing the network had always been waiting to become. Ready for what came next. Whatever it was, wherever it went. The network carries everything, and now it carries us too.